I start speaking about Eisner, obviously, there's no shutting me up. So
Welcome back, everyone. Today we are at Wildwood Cemetery with Danny Fingeroth. We are talking about the legacy of Will Eisner. How are you?
hello, glad to be back. And I'm in Wildwood. I'm in Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum from the movies, but Steve Ditko, who designed Doctor Strange's world, based it on the window in Denny Colt's tomb in Wildwood Cemetery in the Spirit. So it's appropriate, Plus, my hair looks terrific in this background.
Can you tell us about how you got involved working with Will Eisner and the whole legacy?
It goes back to my childhood again, and when I was 12, Jules Pfeiffer's The Great Comic Book Heroes came out. Some of you have probably seen the book. Maybe you've either read the edition that, a version of the original edition that I don't have right here. But I will have it in my slideshow later.
I've read the original.
That's the way to read it, because there's a later version that has the text that R. Sikoriak did a great cover for, but I don't think they could get the rights to use the excerpts from the comics again. So it's well worth reading. But with the original version, it's bigger, it's coffee table size, and it's got the original Superman. And when I was 12 years old, you couldn't, obviously not the internet, but not even in bookstores or libraries could you get reprints of comics from the 30s and 40s. So, and we got partly what we expected. The first appearance of Superman in Action Comics, first appearance of Batman, Hawkman, Captain America,
Captain Marvel,
and then this character called the Spirit that nobody had ever heard of. Nobody, not among my group of comic-loving friends, nobody had ever heard of the Spirit. Nobody ever heard of Will Eisner, because Eisner had sort of taken himself out of the game. He had, I don't know if it's coincidence or not, but in 1952 he got married and he stopped doing the Spirit. So he went into doing a more commercial, instructional and corporate and humor comics and instruction manuals for the military. So the Spirit had not been in print for over a decade. So if you're talking about 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old kids, it's a lifetime. Yeah. Suddenly here's this Spirit, the story of the Spirit in the Great Comic Book Heroes. And Pfeiffer, part of his, one of his motives for writing the book was to reintroduce the world to Will Eisner, because Pfeiffer had started his career as an assistant in Eisner's office. He came in there as a teenager and bullshitted his way into a job. I mean, if you've seen or heard or read Jules Pfeiffer, he's brilliant.
Yes.
And he was the ultimate comics fan at that age, and he knew more about Eisner's career than Eisner did. He was more of an Eisner expert than Eisner was, and talked himself into a job and ended up doing a lot of writing and artwork, which when we go through the slides, we'll talk more. So suddenly I'm introduced to the Spirit. The Spirit's in my world. It was one of the pre-war Spirits, which was it's very film noir, very Wellesian, not quite, didn't have the humor elements that some of the later Spirit stories had. And I'll show you some images from that story, and it blew everybody's mind. And that was, then right after that came the Batman, the Adam West Batman TV show. Comics were, and Marvel was becoming popular, and so comics were becoming the subject of mainstream magazines and books and parental concerns. So Harvey Comics put out a couple of giant-size Spirit reprints. Again, blew our minds. The story I remember most from then is the story, I think it's called The Barber, but it opens up with a multi-panel page, which I don't have in the slideshow. I should make that part of it. A guy is getting a haircut, and he's sort of just having like a typical kind of barbershop conversation with the barber. But then it turns out he's getting his hair cut. He's getting his head shaved to, get to be electrocuted in the electric chair.
Yeah, I remember this one.
And then I think the barber was like the husband of the woman the guy murdered. And I mean, holy cow, maybe you'd see stuff like that on television and shows like The Untouchables, which were very gritty and intense and noirish. But this is the first time, you'd really seen it in comics. And then, so two big reprints like that. And then Eisner was being written about. He did a news story for, I think, for the Herald Tribune of the Spirit somehow being involved with the New York mayoral election of 1965 or 66. And suddenly the Spirit was just on people's minds. I think really because Pfeiffer had reminded everybody about it. Because Eisner, I think, was reasonably content. He was making a good living doing these kind of more, educational and corporate and military comics. But I think he was itching to do something else. And Pfeiffer, I think, just felt, well, this guy just shouldn't be wasting his time doing this stuff. Sure, he's making nice money, but he's Will friggin' Eisner. So that was when my first introduction to Eisner. And then as years went on and the underground comics came out and became popular, Eisner got to know some of those people, Dennis Kitchen and Art Spiegelman and Crumb. I think he got to know Crumb. And James Warren, first Kitchen, then Warren, who was famous for his horror comics and other black and white comics. They put out reprints of the Spirit stories, and they were very. I ate those up like candy. I mean, those were just. And then it was shortly after that Contract with God came out. Not really shortly, but within that 10-year period, Contract with God came out. So that was an interesting departure, to say the least, for Eisner, because everybody knew him from the Spirit. And suddenly here's this whole other thing that's kind of like a Saul Bellow novel or a Philip Roth novel in comics form, which Eisner, how old is he then? He was maybe 60, which seemed very old when you're, 20.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yet here he was reinventing himself, as he would continue to do for years. So I guess it really started when I was 12 with Great Comic Book Heroes. And so cut to years later, I had my whole career at Marvel and started to write books so I was doing, and I met Will a couple of times at the San Diego Con, which is ridiculous. He lived in New York, but I never thought to, maybe by then he was in Florida. This is a whole other thing. I was not one of those people who was bold enough to just go knock on my favorite artists' doors, even though they just lived in, suburban homes that anybody could ride their bike up to. So Will was just always part of my consciousness. Then I got to know him after Marvel, I went to work for a guy named Byron Price, who was starting a digital comics venture that I was running for him called Virtual Comics. And one of the things, Byron, who was my age, was friends with Will. And he was doing what was called the Spirit Screensaver. If you can remember back to screensavers, it was images, like 12 or 20 images from various Spirit comics in black and white, and then like a 15-second soundbite of Will being interviewed saying something about the thing, because that's all the people's computers could handle, was like a 15-second soundbite. So when I finally met Will, really met him working with Byron, everything is context, right? If you bring Will Eisner, well, when he was alive, if you bring Will Eisner to a to a comic convention and he's got like big arrows pointing to him saying Will Eisner, then he's mobbed. But if he's just sitting at like a small publisher's table, so I remember standing on a chair yelling, "Meet Will Eisner! Come meet Will Eisner!" Which is ridiculous. Will was like the biggest star there, but it was just without the context. It's like people would see Stan Lee. Did I mention I wrote a book about Stan Lee? People would see Stan Lee in in the convention and you have like 20 bodyguards and you couldn't get near him. But if you wanted, but he would be eating breakfast in the hotel restaurant the next morning with, maybe one other person with him or something. So it's anyway, so I got to meet Will and work with him a little bit with Byron. And I became very interested in comics history and the fact that, that I am from New York City, but my ancestors, my grandparents were from Eastern European Ashkenazic Jews from Poland and Russia. And a lot of the guys who invented the comics and the superheroes were too. So I became fascinated by that. And that was part of my interest in the history of the business, sort of interesting how this parallel world of comics that I loved and was so influential were coming into existence in the same neighborhoods that my parents and aunts and uncles were growing up in. So that's my interest in Will. So I learned a lot about Will. I researched a lot about him and then I wrote Superman on the Couch in 2004. And Will was kind enough to give me a blurb for it, even though, as we know, he was not a fan of superheroes.
Yeah.
So
he only put a mask on the spirit because he had to.
Yeah, and he had some bad experiences with superheroes. But I think he felt the genre was a dead end as far as he was concerned. So he gave me a blurb, and then I did an interview with him for. I had a magazine that I packaged for Tomorrow's Publishing called Right Now Magazine with a W, and it was about comics writing. So I did about a year and a half before he died. I did a lengthy interview with Will, which was like probably the most nervous I've ever been for an interview. Not that he was so intimidating; he was actually very open and charming. But as you know, as an interviewer, you must think. I know I do, and I'm sure you do. Especially when you're interviewing somebody who's been interviewed 1,000 times, you go, can I come up with even one question this guy has never heard before? So I worked hard and again, for all I know, Will said it to everybody. He said, your questions are very good, which and it's an interview that's been reprinted a lot. But anyway, it was an interview, and then I sent him the raw copy and he gave me notes on it. So that was part of my, getting to know the man behind the work as well as the work, which I'd read quite obsessively, and then all the different publications he did with Dennis Kitchen, and then so I had a Will Eisner. The talk I'm going to give, I've done various versions at Columbia University, at a lot of different places, and this was one where Jules Pfeiffer showed up, which was interesting. I knew I had invited him, but I didn't know if he was going to come or not. It was, when he was living in New York City still, and this is at Columbia University. And I was giving my my life and times of Will Eisner. And I get a call as I'm in the cab on the way to Columbia. Danny, it's Jules. I'm going to be coming to your talk tonight. And of course, I suddenly became 10 times more nervous than I had been. And so there I am standing giving my talk, and my friends are there, my nephew was there. It was a nice crowd through Karen Green and Jeremy Dauber, who Karen still is the comics librarian. Jeremy was very involved with the comics at Columbia then. And I'm feeling like, well, this is surreal. I'm giving a talk about Will Eisner and Jules Pfeiffer is in the audience. This is pretty strange. You know? And at one point he said, one story I'll show you later. He said, I wrote that story when I was 17. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to sit down. And why don't you come up? Because I feel like a moron standing here talking about this story that you wrote. So he did. It was, and then, so through doing events like that, and I'm probably getting the chronology mixed up, because I know it's a longer answer than you wanted, but Carl and Nancy Gropper, who run the Will Eisner Studios and the Will and Ann Eisner Foundation, they're the gatekeepers for everything Will Eisner. I think Carl is Will and Ann's nephew. So I had done, for the very first or maybe the second iteration of what's called Will Eisner Week, which I'll talk about in a little while, I had put together a panel at Jim Hanley's comic book shop on 33rd Street in Manhattan. Must be 10 or 12 years ago. And I put together Chris Couch, who's a comic scholar and professor, Denny O'Neil. I know I'm forgetting one or two other people, but I got Will's best friend from high school, who nobody knew existed except a friend of mine who'd worked with this guy, a guy named Ken Ginniger. I know I'm forgetting somebody. There were one or two other people on. So I put together this panel, and when I was through with it, Carl and Nancy Gropper invited me to be the chair of Will Eisner Week, which is a fancy way of saying I'm the guy who gets on the phone and on the email and whatever other means of communication and annoys people all over the world to get them to do events to celebrate Will Eisner and graphic novels and Will's legacy. And it's always around, because at one point I had made some wisecrack, like, because I would say to people, I'm doing something for Will Eisner Week. And they go, what's that? And I go, so, and again, I'm getting my chronology mixed up, but I think, so maybe I knew Carl and Nancy before that, but I would say to them something like, Will Eisner Week, the best kept secret in the world, ha ha, aren't I funny? And they go, oh yeah, you can do better? All right, you're now the chair of Will Eisner Week, and we're gonna pay you to do it too, so shut up. Don't shut up, that's. So for the past 10 or so years, people know to dread phone calls or emails from me because, aside from being a freelancer looking for work or sometimes an editor looking for them to do some work they don't want to do, I'm trying to convince them to do something, to commemorate Will and his work and graphic novels and free speech and just the whole wonderful world of sequential art, which all kidding aside, people are glad to do because everybody loved Will. And want to do something. So just to pat myself on the back, which I'm prone to do, me with Carl and Nancy and with the people on our different organizing and advisory boards, got it from like 2 or 3 annual events. We now have over 100 annual events. And of course, in the world in which we live, live events are not that popular or healthy these days. Because what we do is we find people who are professors at colleges or own comic shops or taught at schools or whatever. And they, wait, we got a room and we got these students or we have these custom, there's always a way to do something and we leave the rules about it. It doesn't have to be specifically about Will. It can just be about things inspired by Will or about comics and graphic novels in general. So we're in the midst of figuring out how to do it virtually, and we're working out a system where we will probably provide some material for people to use and access that they want online, combined with local things they might want to do either in person if they feel safe enough, or just local things from whatever their venue is. Wow, that's a really much longer answer than you wanted to how did I get involved with Will Eisner. So it starts with Jules Pfeiffer. And if anybody's interested, if I forget to mention this later, which I don't think I will, but if as the months go on, check in at willeisner.com. And if you want to do some kind of event, either live or online, or get somehow hooked in to Will Eisner Week, please let us know, because we would love to keep it going despite the pandemic.
I
Anyway.
remember that book because it was in my college library, first edition. Libraries are helpful, people. Here's the thing about Will Eisner. Yeah.
Who the editor of that book was?
I don't remember.
E.L. Doctorow.
Really?
Yeah, he was working at the publishing company.
I don't remember that. I must been obsessed with the characters that I discovered. So.
Oh yeah, no, that's a real piece of. I mean, the editors in those days generally didn't have that. How would you know who, unless you were in the book industry, how would you know who edited something?
Oh.
But in later years, that was,
like those things are fascinating because you kind of see it as a time capsule of who was and who wasn't big back then.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, of the heroes, you mean, or of the
heroes, the creators? Yeah.
Well, Doctorow hadn't become E.L. Doctorow yet, with capital E.L. He was a respected editor in the book business, but he hadn't broken out as a novelist yet.
I got to do my research on that. But I was looking at I was thinking of like Jack Cole and Plastic Man, and the thing about Eisner for me is that whenever the fan discussion starts up about who the greatest comics artist is of all time, there's a pretty significant portion that will automatically, without any question, they'll just say Jack Kirby.
Right.
And my counter to that argument is that it may be Jack, but I don't think it's a clear-cut argument. And my main argument is that Will Eisner exists.
And as you know, there's a lot of people who that Kirby leaves cold. Not me, but I mean, there are people. I mean, I think Mike Kaluta, who talk about incredible artists, he actually wrote an article. I didn't get a chance to read it, but he wrote an article about how I learned to appreciate Jack Kirby, which to me is a weird thing. I think maybe Ditko is more of an acquired taste. I could see people, but Kirby just, but that's what makes horse racing, I guess. But so I think there are people. I mean, I think you may be rare in your generation, right? I mean, I think people your age probably tend to would maybe more say Sienkiewicz or Kaluta or who would they say?
Well, I mean, among the people who have, studied the history of comics and everything, a lot of them still say Kirby.
Well, that's good.
But like, I was having this one conversation with somebody, and they asked me who the best was, just the plain best in terms of skill and like versatility of skill. And I said, well, if that's the case, I think I might have to say Sienkiewicz.
Huh, that's interesting. Well, you see, that's. I thought you were going to say Eisner, because I mean, I think Eisner is considered the best all around. Kirby, though, I mean, if you look at early Kirby or Kirby in the 50s, before he sort of simplified his work to kind of, streamlined it, he was pretty amazing. He, everybody makes fun of Kirby's anatomy. The guy knew anatomy. He knew all that stuff, and he could do it and had done it.
Yeah.
There's an incredible story from a series that he and Joe Simon did called The World of Your Dreams. Did you ever see that?
I haven't seen The World of Your Dreams, but I know what you're talking about.
It was a series in the 50s or maybe late 40s, maybe, might have lasted 3 issues. I think it was for their own, when they had their own publishing company. And there's a story, because it's a dream, where Kirby is drawing everybody like they're in a Picasso painting. And it was like, holy cow, Jack does Picasso. It's just,
Yeah.
it's what Kirby had in common with Eisner is is this belief in the potential of comics as an art form, not just as a craft and not
Mm.
just as a kind of low level storytelling form. A real belief in comics, the potential to be art with a capital A, and also that they both went through multiple phases of reinventing themselves and reinventing the medium.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people. I think we must have talked about this last time. You get to be good enough at something, say comics, and good enough to get regular work, good enough that the editors keep hiring you, good enough that readers keep buying your stuff, and a lot of artists sort of have one period of innovation, if that, and then they kind of coast on that, on some version of that for their career, and they're fine with that. They're not, their ambitions are not beyond that. Or if they have ambitions beyond that, they're in another medium. But both Eisner and Kirby, till the end, kept putting out work that was experimental and innovative and cutting edge. I mean, they were of a certain generation, so their work did have a certain identifiable look. But so again, we'll go through Eisner's work in particular. It's rare for someone to have one great period, much less several. So that's Eisner, very interesting.
Yeah.
And they did name the Eisner Awards after him for a
Of
reason.
course. Well, my thing was that, like, in terms of their overall influence on comics, I mean, I get that Jack's magnitude especially among superhero artists, was gigantic and unparalleled. But I just feel like Will's influence across the entire comics medium is wider, because I feel like I see it in more.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But I was trying to point out the things that they did have in common. Oh yeah, I think Eisner. They were. I mean, one reason Eisner could and did reinvent himself in the way he did was he had made himself, after growing up in poverty in Brooklyn and the Bronx. He had gotten himself to a point where he didn't have to worry about money. He had, all those commercial endeavors he had been involved in after the Spirit served him well. And so he had the luxury of taking time and being able to focus attention. Because I know it seems weird now to say that when Contract with God came out in 1978, it did not sell, very many copies. People, I bought it. Everybody I knew bought it, but I mean, it wasn't, it wasn't the thing. They didn't even print that many. I think Will actually subsidized the publisher, just to have it out. So obviously, over time, it's made up for that, and it's a standard text. But Will was lucky and skilled enough to be able to have a financial cushion where it'd say, let's try this weird thing that people don't even know where to put it in the bookstore. Even if somebody wants to buy it and somebody wants to sell it to them, where the hell do they put it? Is it a book? Is it a comic? There was no. I mean, that's one of my. I'll skip ahead. Well, later on, remind me to tell you the story about Will in Barnes and Noble, seeing the graphic novel section, because it's a better story in context.
Okay.
So perhaps this will be a good time for me to switch to.
You prepared a slideshow, so.
Okay. All right. That's the name of the. This is what I colloquially call Eisner 101, but the spirit of comics, the legacy of Will Eisner. That's my name. Okay.
Yeah.
Next.
There we go.
This is actually last year's, or it's the 2020 poster for Will Eisner Week. We do a new poster every year, usually always with a piece of art of Will's, the design by John Cook. So we have not unveiled the 2021 poster yet, but we're working on it. But this was the one. So it's celebrate Will Eisner. Will Eisner's birthday was March 6th. He was born in 1917. So this is why Will Eisner Week is the first week of March. Although we're pretty flexible. If somebody wants to do an event, even until mid or late March, we've been known to have Will Eisner Week events in April. So if you have an idea for one, if you want to get involved, you can go to willeisner.com and you'll find out more about it. Next. And that is The Spirit. That is Will's best known creation. It's not the first Spirit, but it's from the first year of The Spirit. The Spirit
1940.
1940. Yeah. And as we were discussing before, Superman you'll see as we go through, but Superman was very popular. Superheroes and comic books in general were enjoying their biggest popularity, even though they've been around in various forms for years. And this, although eventually they were collected and put out as comic books, The Spirit was the headliner of a self-covered insert that appeared in syndicated and appeared in newspapers. So I think it was never in that many papers, but don't forget, everybody read the newspaper. So it was in like 22 papers, which meant it still reached 5 million people. So the way you would have now, if those of you who remember what a Sunday newspaper is or a newspaper is, they're packed with advertising or circulars and the magazine, either whatever your local, either the New York Times or the LA Times or whatever your town is, and The Spirit was that format because the newspaper publishers and this one particular Register and Tribune syndicate wanted to get in on all the action that the kids were, all these kids were buying all these comics. Let's get in on some of that action, not just with our regular newspaper strips, but with the comic book insert. So you see it says on the upper left, comic book section, 3 complete stories. And The Spirit, I think it looks kind of like Victor Mature here, if anybody of you know that old time actor. Will was just going to do him as kind of like a pulp style detective, and the syndicate insisted that since superheroes are popular, he had to have a mask of some kind. So Will gave him that little mask and also a pair of gloves, and I guess that was as much a disguise as Clark Kent's glasses. So nobody supposedly ever figured out that Denny Colt, that The Spirit was Denny Colt. Okay, next. And this is the other, this was the second phase, or maybe the third phase of Eisner's career, was the graphic novels, starting with The Contract with God, which this is the version, I think, when DC Comics was putting out the Will Eisner library. There was an earlier version with kind of a more monochromatic cover, but this was Will rolling the dice and taking a chance. And he wasn't the first one to use the term graphic novel. That's one of those comic book things where there's a dozen debates about who first used it, but he popularized the term and he really put the medium on the map. Again, even though Contract with God at first wasn't a huge seller, it sparked everything from Mouse to Fun Home to any graphic novel you read that has any kind of personal or memoir or literary content that goes back to Contract with God, which will, I want to give it Will's greatest hits, so we can now go back in Will's. So next slide.
Is it true that he came up with the term graphic novel on the spot in order to not say the word comic book to the publisher?
That was his story. It sounds plausible. The publisher was a friend of his, but as anybody in publishing knows, just because the publisher is your friend doesn't mean they're going to publish your work. So Will said to the guy, I got something I think you're going to want to see. And I think his name was Oscar. I forget his last name. And the guy said, what is it? And yeah, Will knew if he said it's a comic book, the guy would say, who cares? Get over it, Will. Comics are for kids, blah, blah, blah. So Will said, it's a graphic novel. And of course, when he got there, the guy said, it's a comic book. But but I think it's, I'm guessing, especially when Will offered to subsidize it, uh, Will was a serious guy and a good salesman, but that, yeah, that was his classic story, that he had to come up with that on the spot. I think there's several other candidates for who first used the term, but I think we can safely say that Will popularized it.
How did it feel as a Jewish guy in New York seeing this comic?
It was definitely, that's a good question. It was surprising to me, I guess. We didn't have the internet, so I don't know how much press I've been reading about it. I knew Will was working on something that was like a serious comic book. Um, I'm trying to think, was it surprising? It was, I didn't quite know what to make of it, because I'd never seen anything like it, but it resonated with me, and it seemed familiar from from the lives that my grandparents kind of lived in what could have been a tenement out of an Eisner. I had older parents, and hence I had older grandparents, so I was removed from it, but not removed from it, and the people and the situations seemed familiar. So it resonated, but it was odd because it wasn't. It was neither a Jack Kirby Stanley superhero comic, nor was it an over-the-top Robert Crumb underground comic. It was some other use of the medium that I think we all had to get used to. But that's so I think it resonated, and I was curious where it would go. If anywhere. I think it's funny, right? We look at this and we say, well, yes, this was the thing that started it all. That gave people license to talk about their families and sexuality and ethnicities and everything. But what if this had been a total dud? What if 5 people bought it? I guess it was in the air. Probably somebody else would have eventually, maybe a Spiegelman or Pfeiffer himself, or who experimented with the form himself. But that's sort of an interesting what if, right? What if Will had just printed those 1,500 copies and said, well, that I got that out of my system. Now I'm going back to doing my instructional manuals for the Army. That's that's a. I think given what I know of Will, it's probably unlikely. I think he would have gone to some other creative way to say. I think he was what we didn't know, and well, I can see we're on the 3rd slide. We're already like third of 140 slides, but
The first few went quickly.
yes. What we didn't know was that this was not just Will attempting to do a comic book version of Bellow or Roth or Malamud, the 3 key Jewish American novelists of the era. But it was a very personal story that he was telling in metaphorical terms. But it was I guess that's what fiction does. It was not a straight on. Later on, he would do straight on memoir comics and things that were more directly about his life. But in this one, he had a contract with God, which again we can go into more deeply, was about a great loss he and his wife had suffered, and this was his way of dealing with it. Again, it's pretty brave for a guy who knew how to write. Clearly he was a writer as much as he used to joke about his joke was that he wasn't a very good writer or a very good artist, so he put them together and became a passable cartoonist. Well, that's very false modesty. You think here's a 60-year-old guy. He's he can carve himself. He's very disciplined with time and very focused. But he did sit down to write a novel, which he could have, right? A lot of people write novels. Maybe he would have needed somebody to edit it for him and structure it, but he didn't. He said, "I'm doing this as," and it's really a series of novellas. It's 4 stories that
Yeah.
are thematically linked by taking place in the same, in and around the same building in the Bronx. Um, but it's, you know, it's interesting that he had the faith in the medium to now take these skills he'd honed over the years and want to do serious literature with them. All right, let's go to the next. Let's get some background on Will. That is young Will Eisner. Those of you who may have seen him in his in the last 40 years of his life might not know that he ever had hair, but he had hair. This was for a series of photos that were done, I think, when the Spirit was about to start its it was popular enough that they decided to do a daily newspaper strip of the Spirit. And I think one of the big papers it was in was one of the Philadelphia dailies, maybe the Philadelphia Daily Eagle. I'm not sure. One of the big Philly papers. And so there's a series of photos of Will. You can tell he's got the same clothes on. It's in the same. I mean, honestly, I think it's his parents' apartment. I don't think I think the most successful cartoonist in comics had not yet moved out of his parents' house. So this. So he was, I think, with his folks, and this was the article, I'm pretty sure, around this period when he was first quoted as saying, you know, at a time when comics were already being attacked. Comics were attacked from the days of comic strips, but certainly the year before, this is around 41, in 1940, a critic named an influential critic named Sterling North had really put out this very widely syndicated article about how horrible comics were for children, for adults, for animals, for everybody. And here was Will Eisner within a year saying comics have the potential to be a great art form. I mean, it's really pretty, you know, sure, he wanted to sell newspapers and sell the Spirit, but I mean, that nobody else, there was nobody else in 1941 saying that comics could be an art form. So anyway, next slide.
Wait, I have a question. You said the
Oh,
Spirit
sure, and feel free to interrupt.
was a daily strip, but I only know it as a Sunday strip. Are you saying there were black and white
There
4-panel
were.
strips?
Yeah, starting a year in the Spirit debuted as the Spirit section that we saw before in 40, but in 41, yes, it was a daily strip. It lasted, I want to say 2 years.
Was it not
Because
seen
what
as
happened,
successful?
you know, it came out just as Will was drafted.
Oh, there we go.
So he did some great stuff. I mean, it's actually somebody who they just, I think that was part of even of the DC reprint. There's one volume, but there are various volumes of those. There's one famous one of, we see maybe it's an invisible person or something. Somehow it's these tracks appearing, these footprints appearing in the snow, and then I think I don't think it's
This is
invisible.
it.
You see the footprints, and then the last panel, you see the Spirit collapsed, you know, face first in the snow because he's been injured or shot or something.
Oh, this is it. He's working on a 4-panel strip.
Oh yeah, yep. There you go. So I think Will started it, and then, you know, like the rest of, I mean, one thing about Will's studio is everybody worked there at some point, and the people that he left who mostly did the strip, I forget who wrote it, but the art, maybe they wrote it too, was by Jack Cole and Lou Fine, I think. So you couldn't have put it in the hands of better artists. But yeah, I don't think it caught on as a daily, especially without Will there to supervise on a daily basis. A daily newspaper strip was what every comic book artist of that generation wanted. You know, that, because syndicated cartoonists were literally, well, they figuratively, literally. Well, you figure it out, but they were figuratively and literally. Yes, they weren't literally rock stars. But they were the rock stars of their time. If you know, these were celebrity Al Capp and Chester Gould and Walt Kelly and Ham Fisher, all those people were written about in the gossip columns. I mean, these were celebrities, and they, even if they didn't, everybody had a different deal with the syndicate, but they, well, Charles Schultz, of course, is the ultimate, I guess, realization of that with the Peanuts empire. But that was what all the comic book artists wanted to be. Comics were really got no respect at all, and the home run for what all those guys wanted, and they were kept from it by various reasons. Some of them having to do with anti-Semitism, some having to do with just snobbishness against comic artists and sheer skill and the clubbishness of the comic strip industry. But so when Will first loved the opportunity. He was doing very well doing comic books, but he jumped at the opportunity to do the Spirit in a newspaper format, and then again also was very happy to have the chance to do it as a syndicated strip. He had lasted about 2 years though.
Okay.
So there's Eisner. I guess I guess it's not that much later. It's probably
probably a year later.
A year or two later, but lit much more dramatically. And that's him in his studio in Tudor City, I believe. He had a studio. If you've been to New York, or if you know the area around the United Nations, before the United Nations was built, that was a strange area. It was kind of a mix of luxury housing and like literal slaughterhouses. I mean, so it was when like the docks of Manhattan, the docks of Manhattan and the edges of Manhattan, which are now, multi-gazillion dollar co-ops and condominiums. Even when I grew up down the block, I grew up in Manhattan. Down the block from where I grew up was a brewery. They were like, I would go to school, and this was the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which was not as uniformly fancy as movies would have you believe, but there was literally beer being brewed in like a 2-block square factory on my corner in what's today considered a very upscale part of New York. So anyway, that was Eisner. So it's called Tudor City, and there was a number of cartoonists had apartments and/or studios there. Next. I just want to give you a little bit of background. That's not for when Will was born. He was born in 1917. Woodrow Wilson was president.
Mm-hmm.
There was a pandemic going on then too. I think Wilson caught it. Anyway, so that was the president then. Next.
It's almost exactly 100 years ago. That's
yeah. Well, we had Will's centennial 3 years ago. Yeah, that's so in the papers before the Spirit and before Peanuts, they had news: U.S. at war. Next. There was stuff going on in Russia with the Russian Revolution. Will was born in interesting times. So next.
So we're kids today.
Yes, I know. God, lucky them. So these were the movies that were popular. Theda Bara was starring Cleopatra. Chaplin was that. There was like a new Chaplin movie every week, including one called The Immigrant, ironically enough. Easy Street. These things are just timeless, aren't they? And Theda Bara was called the It Girl. And she was one of the big, and that's interesting. It looked like she was the producer of this movie too, a Theda Bara super production.
This is stuff that really interests me. Like I was saying earlier with Jules Pfeiffer's book, it's just some people are so big at some point in their lives, and I've never heard of her.
Really? Okay, I'll look her up. She's very interesting.
But I mean, but in comparison, I have definitely heard of Chaplin
Well,
and have
that's
watched Chaplin. So
right, okay. Well, it's funny what names and what images survive. Let's go to the next one. If you found that interesting, this might blow your mind. This was Over There, was by George M. Cohan, who most people know, if they know him at all, from Yankee Doodle Dandy, the Jimmy Cagney movie. Okay, I'm talking to the wrong generation. Do you know who Cagney was?
I've heard of Cagney, but I haven't seen.
Okay, Yankee Doodle Dandy. You should watch that tonight. That's so anyway, this guy George M. Cohan wrote and performed in major Broadway hits of the era. He was a god. There's a statue of him in Times Square, actually.
Yeah.
But the thing that's interesting about this, the image on the lower right is from a play that was popular, not a Cohan play, but it was a hit show on Broadway, and it was called, that's right, Hamilton. And it was about the life of Alexander Hamilton.
100 years later.
100 years later. So that was the year, again, 1917, when Eisner was born. Next.
Stuff cycles around.
And these are people who were born the same year as Will. So do you know who any of these people are?
I wouldn't know. No.
Okay. Robert Mitchum.
Okay.
Dean Martin.
I know Dean Martin.
Okay.
My mom is a big fan of Dean Martin's.
Okay. John Lee Hooker.
No, I don't.
One of the major blues guys of all time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next. Okay, if you didn't know them, you might know the one on the left. You might know the woman.
She looks familiar.
She's June Foray, the voice of Rocky.
Oh, it's June Foray.
Did she just die? I know
she just died like a couple years ago, I think.
Okay, but I think she got past 100. Arthur C. Clarke of 2001.
Okay, I've definitely never seen his picture, but I know who he is.
And then on the bottom is Thelonious Monk and Dizzy Gillespie, the jazz musician.
Oh, that's what they look like.
So those are people born the same year as Will Eisner. And then,
so I actually know all the people here. I'm just not familiar with it because they're more known for their sound.
Yeah. These are, and then next, you might know this guy. Yeah.
Oh man, did that guy beat up Nazis?
He beat up Nazis. And he drew people beating up Nazis. That's Jack Kirby, of course, who we talked about before, and I'm sure we'll be talking about more. That might be the ultimate Jack Kirby picture, with a cigar on a New York street. So that's it. And then the next one.
Wouldn't even know he was a cartoonist.
I
have no idea.
You would think he's a gangster.
You'd think he was a gangster.
I think he likes people to think that. Next. And this guy was born the same year as Will Eisner. This is, in case you didn't know, it's John F. Kennedy.
Wait, Kirby and Eisner were born in the same year?
Yep.
Oh, I thought Kirby was a little younger for some reason.
I think people usually think that Eisner is younger. But no, that's a funny thing about time and history, and that's sort of one reason. I mean, I'm a kind of a history trivia buff anyway, but one reason I like to show sort of who was born then, just to sort of give you an idea of who's contemporary. I mean, people who well, we can get to it later, but Eisner. I think Eisner was born in March and Kirby was born in August, so that makes them like 6 months different in age.
I think I only really think that because Kirby worked for Eisner.
He did. Well, Eisner was very precocious in terms of running his own business. Everybody worked for Eisner. Everybody for Eisner. Everybody worked for Stan at some point. It was hard to be a cartoonist in the 40s and not work for one of those guys, because they went through they produced a lot of material and needed a lot of people. And so they were, and it's a little digression, shocking. Stan was always known to have a lot of work to give to people, and I guess Eisner too. And you could learn a lot from, certain. I mean, if you were an artist, I don't know how much you'd learn. You could learn theoretically from Stan, and Stan give you pointers, but was not himself an artist. Eisner would sit down and just take a piece of, tracing paper and go over your work.
Wonder what that would be like. Okay. And which one I would prefer.
What to have?
Yeah, to be. Stan. Yeah, which one I would prefer to be my boss. That's interesting.
I didn't include it as part of this because we only have like 8 hours. But there is a Stan did a series. I have stills from it. You'll see later. Stan did a series of videos in the 90s called The Comic Book Greats, in which Stan plays host and interviews all these artists. But of course, he stands, or he's not going to shut up, and which is good. But I mean, the one with him and Eisner is it's interesting. A lot of them are on YouTube. That one is not. I'm not sure why, but the one with him and Eisner is very revealing about both of them. It's a terrific show. It's about 90 minutes. All right, what's next? Let's now that we got
Easy Seeger.
So these were the influences on Will and people he cited. This is Seeger's Popeye, and this is the famous excuse me, the famous one. A comic artist ain't no different than you or me or anybody, except he knows how to draw pictures and is crazy in the head. So Popeye, which is still a character people know today.
Yeah, but again, it's
20s,
one of
really.
those things where he's much less popular today than he used to be.
Right, it's a name. Popeye or Seeger or both?
Popeye, because I think even when I was a kid, people didn't really know Seeger anymore. But people still knew Popeye, Bluto, olive oil, and everything.
Yeah, and now I mean,
I feel like the kids today may not so much. They're more familiar with Popeye's the restaurant.
Oh, right. Which uses the logo from the comic and cartoons. I wonder if there are any connections.
Which doesn't have spinach, which is weird.
Some of the things
yeah.
That is interesting, but they have a lot of fried stuff. Next, this is Herriman's Crazy Cat, another classic strip from the early part of the 20th century that, that was just, I mean, you couldn't ask for a more simple, direct approach to cartooning. So next, which probably go through the slides a little faster. This is something that was very influential and is seen as a kind of a proto graphic novel. Do you recognize this at all? Have you seen this?
Is this Max Ernst? No.
No, it's Lind Ward.
Okay.
Lind Ward did woodcut, mostly silent narrative picture novels. They were every page was a single image. This one is from a book called God's Man, God''S Man. And it's Will always cites it as a visual influence and certainly as a proto-graphic novel. His stuff has been reprinted in the past few years. You can find it. Lyndward, Lind Ward.
Okay.
Big influence. Somebody Eisner would talk about would cite a lot. Next, please. This is more of Ward. I think it's also from God's Man. I'm not sure, but this is, if you know your Eisner, if you know your Kirby, you can just, or your film noir, you can just see what an influence this guy was.
Yeah.
And woodcuts are hard. That's okay. This is, in the general world, we have Harvard, Princeton, Yale, schools like that. In the comic book world, many of those creators of the first generation or two did not go to college, but they went to legendary high schools. This is a high school called DeWitt Clinton in the Bronx. It still exists, although at that time, it was an all-boys school. It had 12,000 students. If you can imagine going to high school with 12,000 other kids. Largely because of its position in the Bronx, which was a center of immigrants, especially what I call the classic Godfather trilogy of Jews, Italians, and Irish, with a bunch of Black people and Hispanic people mixed in. DeWitt Clinton has this astonishing alumni list, which you can look up online if you want. They have, but I'll show you some of the relevant, because then DeWitt Clinton figures very importantly in Will Eisner's story and in other people's. I'll show you. Next slide, please. So Will was active, as you would imagine, as the artist, one of the main artists in the school. These were illustrations that he did, I think, for the yearbook. So that's pretty good for 17 or 16. Next. This is a sports uh, cartoon he did for the Clintonian.
And it's a woodcut.
Woodcut by W. Eisner. Clinton was his school. Commerce was their big football rival, the High School of Commerce. Next. And these are some other people who went to DeWitt Clinton High School. On the left is a guy named Bob Kahn, who later became known as Bob Kane. On the right, and he was, I think he was in school with Will. He was a couple of years older. You know, if you know your comics history, you know Bob Kane's exact age is a subject of controversy.
It's not the only thing that's a subject of controversy.
And speaking of Bob Kane controversy, that's Bill Finger. And together they created Batman. But they were among the alumni at DeWitt Clinton, as were let's see the next one. This is their creation.
Of course they go back to high school. That makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think a Finger was a little older, so he may have just been somebody who Bob knew from the neighborhood. You know, they were from it's actually a place called Poe Park.
Yeah.
And, up in the North Bronx, where legend has it the two of them sat and plotted out the Batman origin of the Batman stories. And just a couple of years ago, thanks to the efforts of people, including a guy named Mark Tyler Nobleman. Finger has been finally recognized as the co-creator of Batman, and they named one street that on the border of Poe Park, Bill Finger Place, Bill Finger Way, something like that. I was there for the ceremony.
That's awesome. Years ago. I contributed to that book.
Oh,
just very slightly, because I wrote an article about Finger maybe 10 years ago, and he saw it.
Oh, cool.
And he asked me if I could find him a specific issue where something happened. I forgot what it was. And I actually wasn't the one who found it. A friend of mine found it. Okay. Well, so I guess he contributed to that book.
There you go. So yeah, and you stole credit from your friend, just like Bob Kane did from Bill Finger. Sure. Sure. Carry on that great comic tradition. So a lot of people, Erwin Hazen went there, Patty Chayefsky, if you know your playwrights, Daniel Shore, who was a major reporter and on Nixon's enemies list. He was on NPR for years and CBS. People, and James Baldwin was there. And this next person also went there. Next, please. Stanley Martin Lieber was a student at Clinton High School. That's Stan a few years later, when he was already working at Timely Comics and had changed his name to Stan Lee. That's a blow up from an incredibly detailed photo of, like, I think it's from the I think Martin Goodman took the entire, not just the comics, but the entire staff of his magazines out to go see Bambi, which I guess was a big deal that year. And this was from a lunch he took them all out to. That's Stan. And next, please. And I might have mentioned, I wrote that's Stan, as most people know him, as he looked in the cameos. And that is the cover of my recent biography of Stan, A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee, from St. Martin's Press, Macmillan. The paperback just came out about a month ago.
Yeah.
And if you're
an audiobook.
And yes, exactly. If you like listening to this, then imagine 14 hours of me talking in the audiobook. But actually, I have to say, I have gotten compliments on it, and there were professionals directing and editing me on it. So, but anyway, that exists. Feel free to buy a copy. It's at your independent bookstore, your local independent bookstore, Amazon, the digital version. Anyway, but Stan went to high school, the same high school DeWitt Clinton as those guys. And we can just, in case you don't know who Stan Lee is, this is, of course, the first Fantastic Four. Not the first, the fourth issue of Fantastic Four, The Return of the Submariner.
I think it's the first one with their costumes.
Second one with their costumes.
Okay.
But it's the first one. I guess the Human Torch, in a way, was, a revamped 30s and 40s Timely Atlas character. But the Submariner coming back really kind of led the way to the merging of the Marvel universe of the 60s and beyond with the comics that had come out in the 30s and 40s. All right. I just okay, now, no, please, let's, as you know, I have a lot of, so anyway, the story comes together. Will is, even while he's in school, he's trying to find work. And he runs into Kane on a New York street. And Kane says, I've been doing some work for this new magazine called, wow, what a magazine. And they're looking for people. So he sent Eisner over there. And so that's a cover that Will did. And that saga, we can go. So Will, that was Will's real first professional work. I think he'd done some advertising work, some illustrations for small ads in newspapers. This was his first real comics work. Next, please. This is another cover that I think is a painting that Will did. Comic story, stamps, planes. Yes, that was Captain Scott Dalton. That was a character. Popeye, W.C. Everybody was in this. Popeye, W.C. Fields. This was Will. This was about 1936. Next. And the magazine lasted 4 issues. It had Will's contributions, which again have recently been collected. Was a strip with the unfortunate name of Harry Carey. But what Will did throughout his career was to pretend that the company he was working for had many artists. He would sign his name. Will Eisner is not it's a fine name, and he signed that plenty, and you'll see his signature, or maybe you have. But he was Willis B. Renzi. I don't know where Carl Heck came from. But he would draw and try to draw in different styles and for different genres. You can see Harry Carey is some kind of private eye thing. Uncle Otto seems to be about some kind of eccentric old guy.
Yeah.
So Will would, this is really learning in the trenches. Will just learning all these different ways to draw in comics. Next, please. The Law of Caribou County. This is by William E. Eisner. He did. I'm not sure if this appeared specifically in WoW or in other things he did with this next guy. Let's get the next panel. This is Muss 'Em Up. I'm sorry, this is another thing. Because he partnered up when he went to the offices of WoW, What a Magazine. They were having, which was literally in the back of a garment center clothing factory.
Mm-hmm.
It was, I think maybe this was, and Jerry Iger was the guy running it, and maybe it was an uncle of his or something gave him some space for this cockamamie comic book business, whatever that was, to put out this magazine. So Will helped him out of a jam at the printers. They were having trouble. They were at the printers for the issue. And Will had done some apprenticing in a printing shop, and so he knew how to fix it. And so he and Iger became partners and would put out stuff like Muss 'Em Up, either for their own comics or they would package stuff for other publishers as well. Next. And this is Jerry Iger. So that was, and their company became known as Eisner and Iger, which oddly enough, although Will Eisner, as far as we know, is not related to the guy from Disney.
Michael Eisner.
I believe Jerry Iger was Robert Iger's eccentric uncle or great uncle. So, because Iger was, Robert Iger has spoken about that. So they were partners. They had a shop called Eisner and Iger. They were very successful. They were both cartoonists. Jerry was more of the outside guy and the salesman. Will. Next, please. I can show you.
Seems like that's a combination that works its way across comics.
Well, through life, one might say.
And I just want to say, loving the mustache.
This is Will years later did a graphic novel or graphic novella called The Dreamer, which was one of his thinly veiled memoir uh, pieces. And here he calls it Iron and Samson, as opposed to Eisner and Iger. Will says he always said he got his name first in the partnership because he had like $15 to chip in to start the business, and Jerry either had nothing or only had 10 or 5. So, but this is, it was the Depression. It was the height of the Depression of the 1930s. And so anybody who could draw, you put an ad in the paper and suddenly you got people with portfolios lined up. And Will really had this assembly line system that was not out of place in a former garment factory, of people sitting at boards. And I mean, it says right there, we'll set up like this. I'll sit in the center and lay out stories, pass the lettered pages to the pencil and ink people along the left wall. They'll pass the ink pages up the other side of the shop for backgrounds and cleanup. And that's, that was sort of how that was how comics were made, and to a large degree. Even guys like Siegel and Schuster, who had their own shops, I think set them up probably not for this kind of industrial output, but Superman was a big business, and Siegel and Schuster for a time were the main ones supplying it. That's another comic story. Anyway, this was Will later in the 80s, I think, recalling what his life had been. I don't know if the height differential between him and Jerry Iger was the same as he's drawn with him. And Will was not afraid. I mean, Will was good looking, and he was not afraid to draw himself as a good looking young man. When he drew himself as an older person, he would lampoon himself more and make himself look more like Dolan from The Spirit. Anyway,
loving this page. I always loved the way he did windows and making them look like panels.
Well, that was really one of his innovations in the graphic novels, even more so than The Spirit. This was another. This was a character they packaged. In other words, there were publishers that didn't want to hire whole staff, so they would hire people, what we call packagers, who would literally bring them a package of a completed comic book package. This is one of the characters that Will created. I forget if it was a co-creation with somebody, but it was Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, who exists to this day. And you may notice it is signed by W. Morgan Thomas. That was Will Eisner. That was, of course, yet another Will Eisner pseudonym. So they were very productive and very successful. Next, please.
The jungle genre used to be big, kids. Like,
it was huge, and it's a whole like. And then here's something else they did: Espionage, starring Black Ace. This signed. Now I know I had a couple in here. I forget. I don't think this is one by Kirby, because we'd mentioned that Kirby worked for him. So let's go to the next one. Hawks of the Sea by Willis Renzi. So these were printed much bigger than a comic today. So you could fit all these panels on a comic, but you can see the beginnings of the spirit here. You can see Eisner experimenting with angles and shadows and being very influenced by the black and white films of the day. Next, please.
Loving this one. That one.
Oh yeah.
Oh, here we go.
This is, and then we talked about how all these different people worked for Eisner. This again is Eisner's thinly veiled fictionalization. He calls the Jack Kirby characters Jack King. And this is a story. And again, I don't think Jack was. I've seen Jack Kirby. He was not that short, but Eisner dealt in caricature. So this is a story about a mob guy trying to muscle in and insist that they use their towel services. Yes, in the days before paper towels, I guess that was a big business, getting towels for restrooms and offices and so on. So Kirby, it looks like Eisner is not putting up much of a fight. So you can't say Will is over romanticizing himself here, but then Kirby comes in and chases this big tough gangster. Don't pull any of that mob stuff around here. Beat it, bum.
It works. The height difference works to make Kirby look
Oh,
tougher.
definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
He's kind of like Puck or Wolverine, you know.
Yeah.
And Al Jaffe worked for Eisner, just tons and tons of people, and he worked for Stan. He did something called Inferior Man, which was a spoof of Superman, obviously, for Eisner. Next, that's just a close up of the image. This is work that you can. I mean, you know, if I didn't tell you, you'd still know that's you know that's early Jack Kirby. You know that is Kirby. I think maybe before. I'm not sure where Kirby's career in animation came in, but this is all kind of Jack Kirby, who signs this as
Kurt Davis.
Court Davis.
Court Davis.
Court Davis. So that's Kirby. So just wanted to show, you know, I mean, you can see the way the women are drawn, the way the panels are framed. You can see the beginnings of somebody who was on his way to becoming, you know, Jack Kirby. Next.
Looks like Jack channeling Alex Raymond.
You know, I think all those guys go back to Raymond and again a couple of other people like that. You're right. Next. More Kirby. This is Wilton of the West, who this isn't even signed by anybody. Yeah, it's pretty clearly Kirby. Although, you know, I mean, I say it's Kirby, but I think Eisner, like Harvey Kurtzman, wouldn't surprise me if at least there were thumbnails done by Will or inked by Will. You know, Will generally like to have some participation in anything he was putting in. I think at a certain point there was so much he was putting out so much by volume he couldn't, but but certainly, again, even more so, you can see echoes of what would become Kirby's hallmark styles in the 40s and then another iteration later in the 60s.
These are definitely golden age Kirby faces.
Yep. These guys are Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. We were talking about high schools, and I have little reproductions of all these, so I can kind of map. All right, we don't have their high school, but these were high school buddies from Cleveland, from a neighborhood called Glenville, which was, again, a Jewish immigrant neighborhood in Cleveland. And they lived, once again, Mark Tyler Nobleman has literally counted the number of paces from Jerry Siegel's house to Joe Shuster's house. He could tell you literally how many feet apart they were. And if you should find yourself in Cleveland, Cleveland is very mixed feelings about honoring its comic book greats. But you can find Jerry Siegel's house, thanks to Brad Meltzer and several other people. It's been kind of preserved as signage, and I guess it's maybe landmarked, but it's not a museum. Just regular people live there. Like when I was in Cleveland a few years ago, I asked a guy named Mike Sangiacomo, who was a journalist who covers his beats before he retired. I think he's retired. If you have work for him, don't not call him. I don't know. But Mike knew that. I said I'm going to Cleveland, and I want to go see the Jerry Siegel house. And how would I get in? He said, "Well, ring the bell and tell them I sent you. If they're not busy, they'll let." I went, "Okay." But there was nobody home when I got. It was just surreal. It was in the middle of a huge blizzard. There was like 10 feet of snow. But anyway, these guys invented Superman, and here's the Superman's first appearance in Action Comics in 1938. And with that, they jump-started the comic book. Superman was the killer app for comics. Suddenly, comics were much more popular. Every kid wanted to have them. Lots of grown-ups, eventually lots of soldiers when they were off fighting World War II. This may look like nothing now, but to have this kind of hybrid science fiction, soap opera, dual identity story and character was a big thing. And so suddenly everybody wanted to get in on comic books. Next, please. Anyway, and Superman, was so popular. He was the first character to actually have his own comic. In Action Comics, he was one of many features. so popular. A year later, suddenly he's got his own comic, and Next Please, and Will Eisner sort of get caught up in the story. Batman, although he's not as super powered, obviously was inspired literally by, Bob Kane showing up in the office and the editor telling him Superman's popular, what do you got? And coming in, he and Finger coming up with Batman. A guy named Victor Fox was a publisher who had worked, I think, as an accountant for DC Comics and started his own line, and he hired Eisner to come up with a character that was an imitation of Superman. Again, we have this whole phenomenon now with hundreds of superheroes, and rarely does anybody sue over imitating them. There are just so many, I think they just wouldn't stand up in court. But this was early in that game, and DC Comics sued Victor Fox for this Will Eisner created character, Wonder Man. And, this is not one of the bright moments in Will's career, because Will had said for years that he refused to lie and say, Will had been directed by Fox to imitate Superman.
Mm-hmm.
And Will had always said that he refused to do it in court, but he told that, he refused to lie and say it was his idea and that Fox was innocent. And he always claimed that cost him a lot of money because Fox withheld payment he owed him. The transcripts were found a few years ago, and
I saw those.
And it turns out that Will did what most of us would have done, but he did lie on Fox's behalf, although Fox probably screwed him out of the money anyway. But this was sort of an interest. This might be why Will never really liked superheroes after that.
Do you think he believed it though? Eventually, like he told the story so many times that by the end
he
believed
look, he did put it in a graphic novel, and it's not. He must have. I think that's a interesting human phenomenon that psychologists could tell us more about. But I guess if something is such a painful memory that you don't want to believe it the way it happened, because I don't see how he could have put it in that memoir novel without believing that that's how it happened. It's very weird, and it just makes him more human. But that's a pretty good looking superhero though too, actually.
It's decent. Yeah.
Has anybody ever tried to? Marvel years later had a character called Wonder Man. I guess nobody bothered to copyright or trademark it. But
I don't think I've seen this Wonder Man. No, revived.
I guess because Marvel owns that name.
Maybe, but I see the Golden Age Daredevil a lot. So
did you read that book, that new book about Lev Gleason?
I haven't read that one. No.
Well, American Daredevil, you got to read it. I just read it.
Mm-hmm.
It really, it's an amazing book about Gleason and that whole subsection of comics history that nobody knows about. I reckon, yeah.
More forgotten again. Yeah.
Huh?
For the one of those forgotten areas of comic book history again.
And Gleason and Charlie Biro, they were huge. Holy cow, those comics, they, outside of Marvel, Timely and National, Marvel and DC, Biro that was a big, they read the book. It's really, or look up Lev Gleason and Charlie Biro. Anyway, next. These are, we saw one of these guys before on the right. That's Jack Kirby with Joe Simon. And they, of course, created Captain America, who was punching Nazis a year before America went to war. And it really, this was a controversial thing for American pop culture to take on Hitler. There was a big isolationist movement in America. There was a lot of hostility towards immigrants, and Simon and Kirby, as Jewish comic creators, children of immigrants, were taking a risk in advocating, for America to go into the war and save the world from fascism. But this, and the idea that you would have Hitler as a villain. This was around the time of Chaplin's The Great Dictator, so it was starting to be in the air, but this was still fully, this is cover dated March 1940, so it probably came out in December I'm sorry, it's cover dated March 41. So it probably came out December 1940, a full year before Pearl Harbor.
Mhm.
So I mean, America, there was a draft. I mean, it was pretty clear that America was going to have no choice but to get into World War, to get into the war, but not, there were a lot of people that was not popular with, and this was pretty well. Superman was not punching Nazis, you know.
Well, he was
Um,
beating up corporate lobbyists and politicians, though.
well, no, he was fighting the good fight, but
Yeah.
yeah, well, oddly enough, even Captain America, if you read the first couple of years of Captain America, I know this is a real digression, he actually never went to Europe to fight Nazis. He was fighting saboteurs in
Tours,
America.
yeah.
And more often than not, he was fighting like Frankenstein monsters and crazy horror stories. It was a really interesting, but the covers always had them doing that, so that, and doing their part. So that was controversial and timely. And Simon and Kirby got death threats. You can
Mhm.
see that Jack Kirby was not a guy, because Simon and Kirby were on staff then. They were the editor and art director, and their assistant was a kid named Stan Lieber.
Yeah.
But that's another talk. But anyway, but you could see that Kirby did not take well to threats from wannabe tough guys.
Mhm.
Let us
Oops.
see what's next. And so in the middle of this, with Superman being popular, Batman being popular, Captain America, as well as suddenly it's the era of the superhero. This is the dawn of that age. And so the syndicate they wanted a superhero, and they made Eisner, I think, was looking to explore new horizons like he always was. And he saw this because Eisner and Iger was doing fine packaging all sorts of comics for all sorts of companies. And Eisner let himself be bought out by Jerry Iger. And he went into this business of creating this 16-page comic insert. It was the Spirit with several other backups that he supervised. And this was a big risk, but with the potential of a big payoff. The Spirit did well. Let's say it was in 22 papers, which when you look at something like Little Abner being in 400 papers or whatever, I mean, it never achieved that level, but it was a comic. But it's still, since everybody read newspapers, it still had a potential audience of 5 million people who bought these papers. And it established Eisner as kind of the artist, the guy this is a little crude. This is the first appearance of the Spirit. But as we'll see, his style and his approach in both layout and design and inking and penciling and even, the writing and the lettering. Let's see the next one.
Yeah,
You
here we
can
go.
see even just like a month later in July, already this sense of design and the fact there was no regular Spirit logo for the first few years, which I think drove the syndicate crazy because they didn't have anything they could trademark. But because Will had this double challenge. It was a 16-page insert without a cover. So he had a limited amount of real estate and he had to grab people's attention. So he developed this way of making the Spirit splash pages eye-catching and beautifully designed. So this is what Jules Pfeiffer and a lot of people call the pre-war Spirit, which is a little more serious in tone. You'll see some of the later stuff is a little more kind of Bigfoot cartoony in some way without sacrificing the layouts. So these are more like what you would think of film noir. But anyway, next, please. And we saw this early on. This is one of the most memorable ones. This is the only Spirit section I own. A couple of years ago in San Diego, I was able to find a beat up copy for a ridiculously low price, seemed to me. But I mean, and Eisner here, it's 1940. This is 23-year-old Will Eisner running a whole studio, putting out 16 pages a week, which is 64 pages a month of comics with and doing the strip and probably doing some packaging on the side as well. I think he always was doing some other stuff. So he had no social. When people ask him, how did you do all that work? He said, well, I didn't have a girlfriend back then. That was his, and he had a lot of, again, he had a lot of assistants. Pfeiffer a little later than this, but Lou Fine and Jack Cole and just everybody who was anybody in comics went through and apprenticed with Will. So next, please. And this is Will did get drafted because it was on Pearl Harbor is the day the day after Pearl Harbor is when America entered World War II in earnest. And Will went served stateside doing instructional and propaganda material and newspaper material. So he was stateside, but I think he was so busy with the Army stuff. I don't think he did much. I think Stan there were other artists who were able at points to mail in or find time to do comics work. I don't think Will did much of that during the war. I think he mostly left his the spirit and whatever else he was doing in other people's hands. So there's Will in the Army. Next. That is, he was at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, which I guess, according to Maryland. So I guess that was, I'm not sure exactly what it was. I guess it's an ordnance training center. But Will was the editor and the cartoonist of their newspaper. So he did a lot of work on that. And as you can see, there's definitely that illustration in the top right. We're 1 year old today. Even from a distance, you can see that's a Will Eisner drawing. Next, please. And he also started doing these instructional manuals for military vehicles, and as well as later on for weapons. This was Army Motors, which he packaged and edited while in the Army, and then afterwards as well. Next.
I see it. I see the start of his cartoony style.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, maybe that's, and this is really with this character Joe Dope. I think even then Dope had a little bit of a drug double meaning, but mostly meant, I think it came to mean somebody who was stupid or brain addled, probably because of having taken drugs, but somehow they became synonymous. Yeah, it's got that look of the later. I think Eisner must have figured if he was trying to do material for people in combat, or even if they weren't in combat in the Army who were not happy about being there, then he had to lighten it up. And also, as you can see next, right. I mean, these pilots will gently explain to Joe Dope what occurs in the plane. When a poor little J lets the oil leak away, so the gun blows the back plate in plane. I mean, Will was actually proud all through his career with the military, that he felt that his work saved lives, that through these instructional manuals he was able to keep people from having their weapons blow up literally in their faces and kill or maim them. He never was super political, I mean, and he continued doing it up through Vietnam. Well, I don't know if that implies feeling one way or the other about that war, but this was like I said, he was very proud that that lives were saved, at least from malfunctioning equipment. This got him, as you would imagine, in the 60s and the underground days. I think this got him some sideways looks from underground cartoonists and hippie cartoonists who were totally anti-Vietnam War, and some of them pacifists or whatever. I think this made for an uncomfortable period. Although I think everybody made up and became friends later. Next, please. And this, I guess I didn't, but Will also drew in a lot of those manuals, a lot of sexy women, which to keep the attention. So I guess I don't have that in this presentation, but after the war, Will came back to the spirit, and, he seemed changed, even though he hadn't literally seen combat. I think he just grew and matured and saw a lot and learned a lot. And he took the spirit to another level. This has a look more of the pre-war spirit, actually, even though it's from 1946. There's some of that, I don't know if that's the most complimentary portrayal of an Asian woman. I think Pigalle, who's actually named after the red light district in Paris, or it had been the red light district, or the Pigalle, later became, I think, less Asian looking and more Caucasian looking. But the layout and the tone of this, you can see this is that Eisner's work, and the spirit, it's almost, it's emblematic. The spirit actually, in many of his stories, wasn't in a lot of the pages. He was almost a supporting character. So he almost is here. Pigalle is clearly the focus, but the spirit kind of is watching. Next, please.
It's not the worst depiction of an Asian woman.
True. So Eisner, aside from the story, so he had to put out. He was very influenced by short story writers like Guy de Maupassant and O. Henry. Stories with surprise endings, and of course by the film noir of the era and every other genre. But this is pretty amazing from 1949. He takes, still insisting on doing something crazy with the logo every week. Here, the logo becomes a building. That's pretty astonishing.
Yeah.
Nick. So I'm just going to go through a couple of these splash pages. We can go through these relatively quickly.
I love this one.
Well, this is the spirit really looking like Victor Mature. If you have any Victor Mature. No, it's brilliant. I mean, there's the rain coming down on the lamp outside the classic old time police station light fixture. You just feel like you're right in there with them, but aside from the spirit just looking cool, there's something going on in the background with Dolan and a kid named Sammy. Next, please. And these were originally printed in color, but over the years they've been reprinted in black and white, and some of them just work as well or better in black and white. This is one called Black Alley. We'll see it. I mean, just the perspective on this. Holy cow!
It's great.
And I mean, it's informed. You can tell that this guy grew up in the tenements in the Bronx, right by the subway. Because I don't care how good your reference is, you can't draw that without living it. Next
It looks like he eyeballed the perspective too.
Probably. Well, I don't think he was up in a helicopter,
Yeah.
And I don't think there were any. This is another one, Life Below. We can go through these.
Love it.
This is Man Ray, who was a big influence on Eisner. He was what would you call him? Surrealist? What was the movement he was in? Dada. I guess he was more in the Dada movement.
Probably
he was
Dada,
very influential photographer. I don't know if this is a self-portrait, but this is, looks like the spirit here, actually. Next. And this is one of Man Ray. Man Ray made a lot of experimental films and took a lot of striking photographs like this. I don't know a whole lot about him, but he definitely, Eisner went, when you wanted to see movies that were not the current movies, if you want to see anything that was considered artistic or any foreign movies, you had to go to the Museum of Modern Art, and Will went there all the time, so got to see all these photographs, and was exposed to a lot of material that maybe the ordinary Bronx kid would not have been. Next, please. And this was an influence on everybody. This was sort of the height. This is Orson Welles. Who starring as Charles Foster Kane in Citizen Kane, the movie he also directed at age 25. And Eisner himself had spent a lot of his youth as selling newspapers down on Wall Street, actually. But he was a newspaper kid, which was a kind of, it's a very tough job for anybody, but especially for a little kid guarding your turf. Eisner's written about that, drawn about that in some of his memoir comics. But Welles influenced everybody. Who all these guys, Eisner and Bob Kane and Kirby and Jerry Robinson, who did Batman as well. and they had all been influenced by by German expressionist film and by the black and white films that would later become known as film noir. But Citizen Kane was a movie that had an incredible influence both in film and in comics, and that's Wells. Next, please.
Yeah,
And
Citizen
there's
Kane.
Citizen Kane. I mean, it might as well say The Spirit, on that thing. I mean, and and so Eisner, and again, everybody, all these guys talk about how they were just, in the days before VCRs or DVDs or streaming, they would go and sit in the theater and watch Citizen Kane over and over and over. Next, please. So this is a famous sequence, these next three from Citizen Kane. It's a rainy night. The reporter who's kind of telling the story goes to visit Charles Kane, Forrest Kane's ex-wife. Next, please. And then we see it through the rainy window, and you get that very dramatic effect of the water and the glass. Next, please. And then we are in, with some skillfully done cutting and editing, we're in hearing the drunk and angry ex-wife and of the recently deceased Kane. And so here's Eisner's take on it. Next.
There it is.
Here's the Spirit. It's a little less glamorous. It's not a nightclub. And I don't know for a fact that Will was basing this image on that Citizen Kane, but I think so. It had to have been, if it wasn't a still pinned up on his drawing board, it certainly was something in his mind. So, so Will was able, was influenced by the movies. I have found, certainly Will would always say that he was influenced by Orson Welles. After much searching, I found one quote where somebody said that they heard that Orson Welles said he was influenced by Will Eisner. So I wouldn't take that to the bank, but that's the closest I've been able to. Because Welles was a fan of comics. Welles was influenced by comic strips, especially. There's one really weird Superman story from the 40s that guest stars Orson Welles. I think he had a movie coming out, but it was sort of a riff on War of the Worlds, and that Superman. It was you find it's a crazy story. Anyway, so Eisner brought in as much or more than anybody the influence of film to comics. Next, please.
There's a certain school of thought among some of the more purist comics fans who say, where cinematic is kind of a bad word, but it's really just in how you use it.
I get that, because you sometimes, when I give my What Are Comics lecture, which I'll spare you most of, but I will raise my hands to the limit of the width of my Zoom postage stamp here, and I'll say there's text here and film, or moving images here, and somewhere in the middle is comics, which shares characteristics with both media, but is its own thing. So as a reader and as an editor, I sometimes come across writers who think they're writing movies, and they forget that movies have, actors, motion, music, camera move. Instead of taking advantage of all the things that comics do, they try sort of a pale imitation of what movies do. I think Eisner did not. Eisner, I think, understood what he could take from movies, but what he could also take from L.Z. Seeger and Crazy Cat. He got it. So I know we've seen this image before, but I wanted to. Let me show it in the context of Black Alley. We've seen that next. And this is the story that Black Alley is part of. Next, please. So again, here's a chase scene in with using as if he was looking at it through a camera lens that was distorting. It's just an incredible chase scene of the spirit chasing this guy, and just one of the great Eisnerian touches here is the spirit is chasing a crook on the subway, on the elevated subway tracks. But the people watching just assume if somebody that it's got to be the bad guy chasing him. Their sympathy is with the crook. Run, Mac, run! That's just like that. That's where Eisner, excelled at just those little touches. I mean, just those. That I'm breathless just looking at that scene, and it really ends 2 panels before the end of the page, and I mean, it's just what this guy could do. Just look at that middle tier, the panel on the right. It's just so simple and yet so powerful. The overhead shot.
Yeah.
Anyway, next, please.
You can see the influence on people like Frank Miller.
Oh my God, on everybody.
Yeah.
And then that's actually, I think that may be. No, I guess that's the next. That's the next, right? The next page.
Okay.
With more of that scene, and then you have the guy, the bad guy is, despite the spirit's attempt to warn him to look out, is run over. Yeah, and that, I mean, then again, and it's almost almost a throwaway, that bottom middle panel of just the spirit hanging on by one hand while the click 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 of the. I mean, this is, again, I can't say if Eisner invented this vocabulary. I'm sure somebody could find images like this from somebody, but putting it together like this, pretty damn good. Next, please. And
my favorite.
Yeah, so this was actually Will's favorite of his stories. It was called The Story of Gerhart Schnabel, and it's about a guy, a meek fellow named Gerhart Schnabel, and despite that, this is not a funny story. He discovers as a child that he can fly, but his parents are threatened by it, and they don't want him to seem like a freak or a weirdo, so they like beat it out of him. I have the whole story here, which we don't have to linger on, but we can.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's an early thing. I don't know who else in those days was using actual photo montages. But there, and I've seen several versions. I think Will reworked that page. I don't know if either the photos faded or he wasn't happy with it, but that's, and again, what he and a letterer named Abe Canixon did to make the lettering part of the story about one day on his 8th birthday, to be exact, young Gerhard slipped and fell off a roof in midair. He twisted and turned in an effort to save himself. Suddenly, hey, Ma, look at me, I'm flying. Instead of falling, he flew gracefully to earth. So this is the story. And next, please.
Pretty sure nobody was doing that with captions back then.
Again, it's hard. There were a lot of inventive people, but nobody that so probably there's somebody who studied this with a fine-tooth comb, but this is pretty damn good. I'm always hesitant with anything in comics to say nobody was doing that or he was the first, or there's always some wise guy who will go, no, in this story that came out in 1875.
I'll say nobody popular was doing that. And I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, you can just sort of see the story. Will, it's got a humorous side to it. Next, please.
Yeah, this kind of group of old men would not have been done pre-war, right? Like, because it's too. I
don't know. Like, you think it's spoofing capitalism? You mean? Or?
I feel like it's a spoof of something. Yeah, definitely.
I don't know. I mean,
where they all talk at once.
That would require a better scholar than me. I think the comics were all over the place, and I guess depending on where they were published. So here's another photo of like lower Manhattan, probably, And the spirit, Gerhart Schnabel blunders every street, and somebody is robbed something, and the spirit and Dolan are after them. Why the commissioner is constantly out on cases, with the spirit, who is a vigilante, I don't know, but don't ask, But Gerhart Schnabel here is just thinking he's sick of being repressed by his parents, by his bosses. He's going to fly. So the spirit is chasing the bad guys. Doesn't even notice Schnabel. And again, those are the days when elevators needed elevator operators. There were very few or no self-service elevators. Next. And they get to the roof, and the spirit is punching it out with the bad guys. And Schnabel, nobody's noticing anybody else. And Gerhart Schnabel, there's a big crowd below. They'll see me and I'll be famous. Now that bottom panel of him leaping off the roof, I think I've seen that swiped half a dozen times in various comics over the years. I mean, that's, that panel is famous, not necessarily on its own, which it is, but because of how many people have homage / just swiped it. Next, please.
Oops.
And you spoiled the end. You gave the ending of this 65-year-old story away. So Schnabel flies, and he's finally happy. But the gangsters are still shooting it out with the spirit, and Schnabel comes around the bend. Next, please. And accidentally gets winged. Nobody notices, and so lifeless Gerhart Schnabel fluttered earthward. But do not weep for Schnabel, rather shed a tear for all mankind. For not one person in the entire crowd that watched his body being carted away knew or even suspected that on this day, Gerhart Schnabel had flown. There's a theory that I think Will actually agreed with, that one of the reasons that this was his favorite was maybe he himself felt that all those years when he was just doing the corporate and military stuff, that he wasn't really showing his talents to their utmost, and that he was just sort of keeping himself hidden like Schnabel, and that's why he related so much to this story. That is a theory that I think Will has agreed, is part of the appeal. Next, please. This is, we've mentioned his name many times, Jules Pfeiffer. It's not when he was working for Will, which was when he was a teenager and in his 20s, but it's probably when he was maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, working on one of his own strips, one of his famous Pfeiffer strips. And so Jules, a lot of you may know him as a screenwriter, a playwright, a writer of children's books. He's just recently did a trilogy of graphic novels, which are very Eisner inspired. We'll look at it a little bit later. Anyway, that's Jules Pfeiffer. Next. And this is a story from 1950, which, again, Pfeiffer and Eisner collaborated on a lot of things. And I think that in later years, people have sat with them and gone through printed stories and say who did what, and they never agree who did what, and not necessarily to hog credit, but to give credit to they had a very symbiotic relationship. So this allegedly is New Year's Eve. Obviously it was drawn months before, but it's the spirit that came out on New Year's Eve 1950, and the conceit is that it's and look at this, it's Eisner is late on his deadline, so he's going into the office to work on the spirit, which is, in this case, is the sign on the door, and when the door is closed, it's backwards on the glass. I mean, it's an incredible page. Now all I need is a good New Year's story. No, oh ho hum. Okay, next page. Eisner has fallen asleep, and his jealous, evil assistant sneaks in, who Eisner drew not only to look like Pfeiffer, but a really unflattering view of Pfeiffer. And he comes in and shoots the sleeping Eisner in the back, and then the phone rings, and it's the newspaper wanting the spirit story. So the character, who is not Jules Pfeiffer, for years, all I've been doing is sharpening pencils, erasing pages, and drawing little children's pictures. I am better than all this. No more little children for me. I will draw a spirit story, the like of which the world has never seen. Next page. And this is a color
Yeah.
close-up of just how of that awful caricature. Next. And this is what Jules was doing, a kid strip called Clifford, which oddly enough was made into a movie with Martin Short like 15 years ago. So in comics, nothing ever dies or goes away forever. Anyway, Clifford was a humorous strip starring a kid named Clifford, but here some combination of Jules and Will combined to come up with Clifford as the spirit, with a yo-yo and stuff blowing up, and him saying, "I must be the spirit. I must never carry a gun, but still, I must fight crime barehanded. No other crime fighter can make that stupid statement." So it's almost Mad Magazine. It's almost as if, it's almost Harvey, and it's
It
Pfeiffer.
predates Kurtzman, yeah.
Yeah, predates the Kurtzman Mad, maybe
Yeah.
not the Kurtzman Hey
Not
Look.
Kurtzman, yeah.
I mean, look, and it's got all the noirish, spirit hallmarks. It's got the logo that's turning into dripping
Rain, yeah.
It's got the old school antique lampo. I mean, it's very. So this is the kind of thing that made the spirit different. Next, please. Then near the end, um, I'm not even sure how much Will. This was literally the last story arc of the spirit, written by Pfeiffer. And I guess I think it's true with any comic book, a comic strip character. When you can't figure out what to do and sales are tanking, you send them to outer space. Maybe that tradition started here with, and I mean, Wally Wood was drawing it.
Yeah.
Pfeiffer was scripting it. I think Will was still supervising and editing and contributing, but this was literally the end of the line. He was about to or had gotten married. I think, just was starting a new phase. Next. So then in this, and Will picked whether intentionally or not, he picked a good time to kind of get out of I mean, actually, Will had not made monthly comics since 1940. He'd done some packaging after that, but really he was out of that mainstream, what Lee and Kirby and all those, people were doing. And this was the era of EC Comics, which also published Mad, but published horror comics and crime comics that were very violent for the time for him, became very controversial. And so Will actually chose a good time to not be in the business. Next, please. And this was a guy named Frederick Wortham, who was one of the main crusaders against comics. He was a Austrian psychiatrist who come to New York, he was Jewish, but he came to New York not as a refugee. He came in the 1920s to study psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, and stayed and became a pop culture critic and expert, and took aim at comics. And again, that's a whole other presentation, but was in many ways, along with the advent of television, was responsible for comics which had been selling literally in the billions in the 1950s, imploding, and the institution of the Comics Code. If we're talking about Jewish content and Jewish creators, next please, one thing that did come out of all that, one of the few stories to address the Holocaust at all in the post-war years, was a story called Master Race. And it was written by Al Feldstein and drawn by a visionary cartoonist named Bernard Krigstein. And this is about a death camp survivor and the commandant of the camp who escaped justice, meeting in the New York subways. But this is regarded as one of the high points in comics ever. You can see Krigstein wasn't just batting out comics for page rate. He was doing all sorts of things with abstraction and layout and breaking time up into segments. That was pretty revolutionary. And in the content, it was, as I said, it was another 10 years, probably required Mouse coming out for comics to really address the existence of the Holocaust at all. It's not so. It relates to Eisner in the sense that this was an early sign that maybe comics could be more than superheroes punching each other. Next,
Mm-hmm.
please. And so as a result of all this stuff, and if you know the history, good, but I've been going on too long already, so not. But essentially, the superheroes comics imploded in the 50s. They started coming back. The superheroes came back. Starting more or less with The Flash in 1956 at DC. And, Eisner was still doing his instructional stuff, his military stuff. This was not, next please, we can see a picture of Will. And there was Will. I mean, I guess he was already doing some things with the spirit, obviously, but this is more or less, he'd lost that hair that he had in those early pictures in the 40s. And he was a businessman, but that didn't mean he still wasn't working in an office with like an exposed radiator. It's not. There was still comics. And next place, he was doing PS Magazine, which was a successor. And as we had said, he discovered that among things soldiers like to look at is scantily clad women. So, the joke here is that I guess she is Connie Rod.
Yeah.
That name, but Connie Rod is apparently running the car wash detail, and these guys are all eager to join her in the car wash. So this is what Will was doing, and making a nice living at it, and he was not prey to all the insanity going on with Wortham and the business imploding or not, or expanding, or this was not Will Eisner's concern. Next, please. So I've been going on a long time. So it's
cool.
This was the again, just more of the kind of material Will was doing. Somehow he's humorously getting across how to grease your engine. Everybody knows you only need a grease job every 1,000 miles, which sounds kind of dirty, but Joe, we've been anyway. So this is what Will Eisner was doing, and but then next, please. More of the same. This is more sex and car repair. Next.
Sex and car repairs. I love it.
Will would always try. He was always, game, so to speak, to try something new. He and Pfeiffer, I think, did. They tried a comic called Baseball Comics, which I think lasted either 1 or 2 issues. Next, please. At some point, actually, while he was doing the graphic novels, he was just. I'm sure he would love to have made money on these things, but I think he had a mind that just wanted to do stuff. So here's Will. He had a lot of these guides to communicating with your plans. Had Will Eisner's Guide to Astrology. He was at a weird period because I think because of Pfeiffer and because of the underground, I think he was being rediscovered, but he didn't quite know what to do with that new fame. So he was doing all this strange stuff. And then next, please. And people know emerging eras. I'm kind of telescoping things that happened in the 60s and 70s. This is the great comic book heroes I talk about, the book by Pfeiffer. It was the holiday gift of 1965 for anybody who was a comic fan. This was because again we had never seen Joe Shuster's artwork on Superman. We'd never seen, Bob Kane's. I mean, maybe we'd seen some annuals, but not in context and not the 40 stuff. It's just mind blowing. And compiled, introduced, and annotated. Pfeiffer's text in this is hilarious and very full of historic information. Next, please. This is the story I was telling you about. This is the Jewel of Death. It was the spirit story that was reprinted in Great Comic Book Heroes. Nobody that I knew, no kid that I knew had seen it or any idea what it was. He's in an Egyptian bazaar. He's wearing a white suit, which is odd. I don't know if I ever saw the kid wear a white suit. It's like a Casablanca. I guess it's Eisner's take on Casablanca. Oh, no, wait a minute.
It came out before Casablanca.
The year before Casablanca. Casablanca is Bogart's take on the Spirit, and Michael Curtiz's and the Epstein brothers. But this is, I had never, as much as I loved, you know, Lee and Kirby and Ditko and Steranko, and it was a little before Steranko, but as much as I loved all that stuff, something about this really, this did precisely what Pfeiffer wanted, was it put Eisner back on the map, and people went, where do I find out more about this guy? Next, please. The same era, just to give you some context again, it was the era of the Batman TV show in the in 66 and 67. Next. There was a Superman musical on Broadway that I went to.
Mm-hmm.
Any
good?
No, terrible. I mean, was it good? It was weird because it wasn't that much about Superman. In retrospect, I guess because to have somebody fly on a Broadway stage in those days must have been very difficult and expensive and terrifying, So it was mostly about a character played by Jack Cassidy, who was the father of Sean Cassidy. His father, you're too young for any of this. Who was the Cassidy who was the big singer in the 70s? Anyway, this is his father.
One of the monkeys?
No.
No.
He was a big star, and anyway, his father was the star. So it was mostly about this character, a reporter from the Daily Planet that wasn't from the comics. So the story, and then there was Superman and Lois Lane, but very little of that. So I was disappointed. It was written, actually, the play was written by Newman and Benton, who, like, the next year would become famous as the screenwriters of Bonnie and Clyde. I mean, look, I was 13 or whatever I was, and it was fun, and my dad took the day off and took me, so I enjoyed it on that level. But I was really puzzled by why a show called It's a Birds That Planet Superman hardly had any Superman.
Okay.
So anyway, that.
Oops.
Next, and right around this period is when Eisner did this. I think it was early 66, so the election must have been 65. And it refers to Mayor Lindsay, who was the mayor of New York. I'm sure there's a story about how Will got to do a spirit story that lampooned local New York politics. It was part of I know that the Herald Tribune that week had a whole series of articles about comics. It might even have been, if not that issue, then around that period when Nat Friedland's article about a plot conference between Lee and Kirby that really, put a monkey wrench in their relationship. It might have even been the same issue. So there was this sense that comics were popular, comics-based entertainment was popular, and maybe somewhere in there was a place for the spirit, although I don't think he was eager to do a revival. Next, please. Harvey Comics, which put out, is best known for like Casper the Friendly Ghost and
Richie Rich.
Had a superhero line in the 40s and 50s, and I think one of the more gory horror lines, I think. And Will made a deal with them. I'm not sure the details about reprinting a bunch of the classic spirit stories. So he did a new cover. And they're absolutely boss stories, which was a expression that we used. I never used, but was in use in the 60s. Next, please.
Some boss. That's been used recently. I didn't realize people used it back then.
It's probably retro and came back. So this is Will with Dennis Kitchen, who was the founder of Kitchen Sink Press. And although Jim Warren did reprint the Spirit for a while, Kitchen really had started the reprints, and then when Warren stopped printing them, got it back. They were, Kitchen is very involved with the Eisner estate. He represents Will's work, and they were good friends. And he was one of the first people. Will knew there were these underground comics, and he went to a comic convention in New York where he met Dennis, and he met Art Spiegelman and S. Clay Wilson. He met a lot of the a lot of the first and second generation underground people. And the lesson he learned from that was there are comic books coming out. Will was not going to do wild and crazy drug and sex and rock and roll underground comics, but there's an audience of people that understand how to read comic books and like reading comic books, but don't have any interest in superheroes and don't have any interest in Archie and Betty and Veronica. But if you gave those adults something with meat to it, with literary value, maybe they'd go for it. And that's where Will started thinking about a contract with God. Next, please. And then this is representative of, this was maybe the most famous underground comic of the era, is Robert Crumb's Zap Comics. Actually, I saw an exhibit of Crumb's work in New York a few years ago, and there's a lot more in common between Crumb and Eisner than you would think. I mean, just their approach to layout and camera angle and the figure. It's interesting to compare them, which I'm not going to do now. So next, please. And this was an issue of Snarf. I guess it was Kid by Kitchen Sink, where Will did the cover, and it read like what it is, which is a middle-aged guy trying to take what he's familiar with and what he's known for and kind of merging it with the hippie culture of the undergrounds. And it's an uncomfortable fit, but it's nice that I think Will was willing to give it a try. Next, please.
Nice that he was willing to understand what the new generation was doing.
Well, I think we'll get back to a contract with God, which I'll keep going.
Okay.
And so from then he started for Kitchen Sink. He would do was reprinting a lot of the Spirit, and Will was doing new painted covers. So there's this, which is striking. Next, please. And this says a Eisner femme fatale, and the Spirit tied up as he often was, while still being seduced by a beautiful woman. That's a classic Spirit thing. Next, please. The Rain, Kurtzman.
It's another Spirit thing, the Rain.
An Eisner thing, Harvey Kurtzman, who invented Mad Magazine and was good friends with Will. They both taught at School of Visual Arts in the 70s. He gave that Rain, he called it Eisenspritz, which takes the German or Yiddish spritz for rain or spraying and puts Eisner's name. So it's known. I don't know if they're a trademark, but yes, it's the Spirit and Dolan, and I think they're by what looks like the Queensboro Bridge. Eisner never said the Spirit was in New York City, although it was clear he was. He called it Central City, which gave him license to not have to be accurate in every single building he drew.
Except when he's using photographs, he's using New York City, so.
Yeah. And he wasn't fooling anybody, but then nobody could say to him, you drew the Woolworth building wrong or whatever. Or that street doesn't intersect with that street. And Kirby did the same thing, and he was calling it New York. Next, please.
Oh, hey.
So we're talking about the late 70s, and the culture is now, the first Superman with Christopher Reeve has come out and is very popular. Next. And even
the last
Stanley
one.
and Jack Kirby are doing what has come to be called the Silver Surfer graphic novel. As you can see, when it first came out, actually the left is Kirby's cover that wasn't used. They ended up using a painting, I think, by Bob Larkin. And it's called The Silver Surfer, The Ultimate Cosmic Experience. In retrospect, it's now known as the Silver Surfer graphic novel, but it was a full-length Surfer story. It was actually copywritten. The copyright was to Lee and Kirby, not to Marvel.
Really?
Series of reasons, yeah.
Is that why it's never been reprinted?
Has it really never been reprinted?
I believe it's never been reprinted, yeah.
Maybe that's why. I think there's a lot of myths and legends. I think the idea was, that's why the Fantastic Four are not in it. Even though they're part of the original origin of the Surfer, and obviously when Galactus first appeared. think there was talk of doing a surfer movie, and then Stan owed work to Simon and Schuster, and Kirby owed work to Marvel. It was some weird, yet another convoluted, period in their relationship. But I think the idea was if they did this with their own copyright, then if they did make a movie, they'd have to include them in the deal. I don't know if any lawyer
Yeah.
actually told them that, or if this is just but somehow it's not copyrighted to Marvel. It's copyrighted but maybe you're right. Maybe, although you would have to think that if you get enough lawyers in the room, maybe they could figure out how to reprint it, because I think people, that's interesting. I didn't know it hasn't been, I mean, it's certainly available, um, as a used edition. So this is the era. So next, so then,
If it has been reprinted, the reprint is also out of print.
okay. And so this was the original cover that I talked about of Contract with God. This was printed by a small publisher, friend of Will's. As I said, Will subsidized it. He was comfortable enough that he could spend, a year working on a project like this. And this was, there's a very sad, depressed figure walking up a slum staircase, being soaked in Eisenspritz. Next, please. And the story, I mean, what later was revealed, although not until not that long, just a few years before Will died, this lead story, the one called Contract with God, is about a very pious Jewish guy, whose daughter has died as a teenager, and the repercussions in his life. Well, it turns out that Will and Ann Eisner had a teenage daughter who died of leukemia. And she had been, by all reports, the archetypal, cheerful, happy-go-lucky, vivacious teenager, and then was stricken down by this. And Will was devastated, as you would imagine. And so it came out in this story about, next please, about this pious man who, as a young man, made what he believed was a contract, what he called a contract with God, an agreement through prayer that if he obeyed all the laws and strictures of Orthodox Judaism, that he would not suffer any undue tragedy. But so this is Will's, but then he does. And so this is Will's way of working it out, and Will's attempt to enter into the world of Bellow and Malamud and Roth. Next, please. This is probably the most famous pages. I mean, look at this page. This is where Eisner even more, although it's not the style doesn't call as much attention to itself as the spirit, layout and design, but still, this is a lot of what he did in the graphic novels. There's no panel borders. The panels kind of dissolve into one another, and yet it works. The storytelling couldn't be clearer. And then, oh my God, that last panel of that effect that you get when you look at lightning, and you see the lightning is black and the sky is white. Well, holy crap! Will Eisner just did that on a third of a small page. Right? Interesting. He drew this. This came out, I don't know, maybe like 8, maybe 5.5 by 8, or by, it's small.
Smaller than a usual comic.
Yeah, smaller than a comic, more of a paperback size, a large paperback, but not, Eisner, not only did he draw it pretty much print size, but it's turned out, and we'll see more of this, he inked it on vellum. In other words, he inked it on overlays, so the pencils still exist. The pencil work for this entire book exists separately from the inks, which is, anybody I know who inks, that's a really, I mean, you can do it, but most people don't like to do it. It's on what's called vellum, which is a kind of specialized paper that doesn't always hold ink the way, but will. I'm not, and nobody's really, maybe Dennis Kitchen knows why, but it's, not really clear why he would have done that, because he didn't sell the originals. The originals only recently have started being sold by his estate. Next, please. So here's some more pictures. So the guy loses his faith and he becomes a creep and a ruthless businessman, and all the things that he didn't want to become, he becomes. But and then it's got an ironic, next please, got an ironic O. Henry style ending. These are some of the other stories in it. This is called Cuchulainn, if you wondered how to pronounce that. And it again goes back to Will's childhood and youth in the Jewish Bronx of the 30s. Cuchulainn was a very modest kind of cabin up in the Catskill Mountains in New York State. And so anybody who could afford to or could get a job at one of these resorts would get out of the slums of the Bronx. Next, please. And this is a story about a guy, several different people, and it's a really dark, I mean, the thing about Contract with God and a lot of Will's work, it's very dark. These are not, these may be people that you can sympathize with or relate to, but a lot of them are not very nice people. But this is even Will, even here, toying with autobiography. The two kids looking down, and the father, I guess the mother is saying, "Come on, kids, we're leaving. We'll be late, Willie." Next, please. And this is really Will, and this is about Will's 15-year-old Will Eisner losing his virginity, which is again not what you would have seen in The Spirit, and it's a wild story, and it's about this older married woman who seduces Will in this barn at the resort, and yet it could in a way be a spirit story. I mean, it's drawn, so expressively, and she, comes to visit him at night. Next, please. And then, of course, I don't want to give away the ending. B, you should read it. I mean, it's an incredible story for a guy who comes out of the golden age of comics and stretching creative muscles. So this is they're back in the city, and I think maybe his father, I think maybe had a girlfriend, or for some reason his father gets kicked out of the house, and his mother is now saying, "No, Willie, vacation's over already, so start getting ready for school. This year you're going to have lots of responsibility around here. Your father is going to be traveling a lot, so he'll be the man of the house now. You hear me, Willie? Willie?" I mean, so this is, as great as Jack Kirby or Joe Kubert, Kubert actually did a lot of autobiographical stuff. As great as Kirby was, I don't think we ever saw the story of Jack. Jack did one or two stories. There's one famous one called Street Code.
Yeah.
But I mean, this was Eisner's work for the rest of his life, pretty much. This was 78. He didn't die till 2005. And this is a page he added, I think, for a deluxe edition, just a different view. And I mean, again, this is Will Eisner at a time, if he's approximately in his early, he's like 60 or 61 here.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of 61-year-old cartoonists, especially of that generation, who are suddenly discovering new storytelling muscles they never knew they had. And I think this additional page was maybe even done 10 years after that. So that's why we're spending 3 hours talking about Will Eisner. I think we're getting near the end, everybody. Don't
I appreciate it.
Okay, let me keep next. And so Will kept going with a series. This was a thing called The Dreamer, which we talked about before, which talks about the comics business and the people in it at the time. Next. I think we can start sort of flipping a little more quickly. I think you get the idea.
Because The Dreamer is basically what you just presented.
Right.
Up to now.
And that's and it's him. And then The Heart of the Storm is really maybe his greatest work of all. It's
really
about his life growing up as a kid and his, and sort of how he went from being this naive kid in the Bronx to how he got into doing the Spirit and encountering anti-Semitism, in the streets of New York and in the army. And it's an incredibly crafted story. I mean, if you only read one Will Eisner graphic novel, even more than Contract with God, I'd say Heart of the Storm. Next, please. And these are some pages from it. It's told as a series of flashbacks of Will reporting for duty in the army.
It is like, I'll say that, Contract with God gets a lot of praise, deservedly so, for being first. But, you should hope that if you kept it going, then the others will, be at least as good. So.
And again, the fact, I don't know when the right place for this anecdote is, so I'll throw it in here. There's an interview a writer named David Haydu, who wrote The 10-Cent Plague, did with Will. I think it was published maybe in the Comics Journal. Will and David are in a New York City Barnes and Noble, and they're in the graphic novel section. And David says to Will, did you ever think you'd live to see the day? And isn't it amazing that not only is there a graphic novel section, but within the graphic novel section, there's a Will Eisner section. Isn't that amazing? And Will says, yeah, it's okay. But I should be over in literature with Malamud and Roth and Bellow. I'm chronicling the same tales of Jewish American life in the first half of the 20th century. They are. Why am I not over? So yeah, I'm sure Will was, but
yeah,
so that was, I thought, an interesting, I don't know, just story.
He didn't want to be categorized according to his medium.
He didn't. He felt he wanted to be categorized
according to his content.
The content and the seriousness he brought to it. That it wasn't, two guys in spandex punching each other. So next, these are some pages. Again, you should read the book, but this is Will's interpretation of his father's, or I guess it's his mother, talking about their parents, when they came to America in the 1880s and other eras. Next, please. I mean, it's just
beautiful. It's beautiful.
It flashes back to Vienna in 1910. This is a guy who's been doing this for 40 plus years, and he's not only not resting on his laurels, he's doing one of these a year. He's doing a graphic novel a year, and he's teaching, and he's writing textbooks, and he's in his 70s or 80s. Next, please. I found this interesting, for a particular reason. If you look at that upper, this is part of, I forget which one it's from, if it's Heart of the Storm, one of the others, but it's Will as a kid doing the typical cartoonist thing, which is, having the other kids in the neighborhood not beat him up because he can draw well. But look, go to the next one. I have a close up. It's little Will Eisner drawing Lindy's airplane. Now, if you know your history at all, Lindbergh's airplane, before Lindbergh became a virulent anti-Semite and an isolationist, when he was still a hero, was called the Spirit of St. Louis. So I have no idea if Will took the name for the Spirit from that at all, but I just, and I think Will must know that because he doesn't say the name of it. He says, wow, he drew Lindy's airplane. Gee, you're some good draw. So that's a nice little piece of inside baseball there. Next, please. And then this is Will. I think this is in To the Heart of the Storm. Here's a guy who likes him. I think he's a guy. I'm not sure if he's the guy who owned the syndicate that bought the Spirit. I forget the exact context, but here's a guy who's taking Will out for a drink and likes him. And he's talking about Jews. And now they're pushing America into a war with Germany, a plot engineered by the Jewish bankers. Let me tell you, the Jews in this country don't have long to wait. Soon they'll be found out, and put enough of politics. How about come to my house for dinner next week? So this is, and then there's Will, kind of in shadow, very disillusioned and very hurt, obviously,
of course,
frightened. And so Will was not only interested, as we'll see, I'm not sure where the slides, well, he was very concerned about the resurgence, not just anti-Semitism in general, but the resurgence of this completely false document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was this book is about Will's investigation of where it came from, and that it was a completely political maneuver done by Russian politicians using anti-Semitism to take attention off their own misdeeds. But you see it, you see it quoted, unfortunately, regularly. It's, I don't even like to look for it on the internet. This horrible slander and false document. So Will became really, really concerned. And the last thing he finished before he died was this book, The Plot. So there's a couple of pages from it we can look at quickly.
Yeah.
And again, this is a guy 87 years old. This is pretty good for an 87-year-old.
It's really good.
Who's going to be dead in a month. This is pretty good. And there's sort of and obviously did a shitload of research for it. Next, please. And this character is never identified as Will, but it's clearly Will.
It's clearly Will, yeah.
He's investigating. He's going to different libraries, and he encounters this anti-Semitism firsthand. So
that one line, even if it is a fake, people should read the book because it reveals the Jews, is kind of just
sounds
emblematic
familiar, huh?
of a lot of things right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes. Unfortunately, Will was ahead of his time.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. So this was the last thing he finished shortly before he died. Next, please.
Yeah.
And of course, from not that book, but from Contract with God and from Will's whole body of work, look, I'm sure Art Spiegelman would have done Mouse in some way, shape, or form. He'd done an earlier version of it in the 70s. But Will was sort of the pioneer for books with a great deal of either comics with Jewish content, with autobiographical content. And then, of course, Spiegelman takes it to the next level using quote unquote funny animals and still making it serious. But the whole world of graphic novels we have now, I imagine the people involved are too talented not to have surfaced, but I think Will really pioneered a trail and said, hey, if I can do this and I'm in my 60s and 70s, imagine what you young people can do. And he put his money where his mouth was that too, teaching at SVA.
Yeah.
I guarantee he didn't make a lot of money teaching and doing those textbooks of his, which people still use. I think next, please.
Kick the door down.
Yeah, so this is one of them, Comics and Sequential Art, which I think is still a standard text. Next, please. And there's Will and Anne. I guess probably in the 90s, or maybe he died in 2005, so maybe a year or two before he died. Looks like they're at San Diego. Next. And here is Will and Jack Kirby. Will was not that florid, and Jack was not that pale, but it's the only picture of the two of them. One of the few pictures, and they're exactly the same age. It's one of the great comic book industry art form pictures of all time, I think. If somebody knows what they're doing, I'm sure with Photoshop you could balance out the colors, but really, why?
Why? It's a trick of the lighting. It's fine. I heard Kirby always called him boss. Didn't matter what he'd accomplished, or no matter what age it was.
I didn't know that, but that. Well, I guess in terms of their seniority in the business, I guess Will was his, he had his own business before at a very young age.
And maybe he just got used to it, I'm thinking. That's
cute. Well, look, I know, I know people have that kind of relationship with people who haven't been their boss for 25 years and still call them boss, affectionately, Next, what do we have? I guess is another one of this is a picture from, I think, an Ink Pot Awards at San Diego.
He has a mustache.
Will had a mustache for a while and sideburns, I guess, when that was fashionable in the late 60s. So there's Gil Kane, Kirby, who always looks cool, Stan, Steranko, Will Eisner, and Jerry Siegel. And I think it's half of another picture. I didn't have the other half, but it's a murderer's row of comic legends.
That's insane.
Next, please. And this is the story that I was presenting when Pfeiffer told me that he had been the writer of it. I think when he says he was the writer of it, he wrote it, but I think he always says anything he wrote that Will edited, and that he always felt he was channeling Will. So this is a story called 10 Minutes. Again, if you're worried about, there's a spoiler alert for this 70-year-old story, so I'm warning you now. But it's very much said, and Pfeiffer, his theory is that the spirit was Jewish and that he sort of was Eisner's avatar, and that even though his name was Denny Colt, that he was sort of a stand-in for young Will and sort of had a lower middle class Jewish background. So this is that milieu. This is a tenement in the Bronx, the kind that both Will and Jules might have grown up in. And it's got, a girl playing a name game with a ball and a kid reading probably a comic book. And there's this guy, Freddie, and it will take, the story telegraphs its ending. Anyway, it will take you 10 minutes to read the story, a very short time in any man's lifetime. But these 10 minutes that you will spend here are an eternity for one man, for they are the last 10 minutes in Freddie's life. Freddie also happens to have the Spirit logo painted on his apartment building. That changes perspective as the camera. Next, so let's
and
go.
You don't see it either. You don't see the full Spirit logo.
No, and you have to almost be looking for it, which I guess at this point, readers would be looking for.
I have a question. Did they eventually trademark this thing on the upper left, the Spirit section?
I don't know if he did, probably, because he did trademark the Spirit, a version of the logo, the one that we saw on on one of the kitchen sink books. There is a trademarked Spirit logo, and I would guess, again, that's a question more for Dennis Kitchen or for the Eisner Studios people. So we can go through this. I want the first few pages of what I want to.
It's this logo, right?
That's the logo. Yeah.
Okay.
Next page. Yep. And that was the 80th anniversary edition of the Spirit that came out earlier this year.
Yes.
So this is an archetypal kind of New York candy store. They had them still in my childhood. It says candy, but it's cigarettes, magazines, comic books. It's a luncheonette. In the days before people had phones in their own apartments, you can see here. This was a candy store in the Bronx. This Pfeiffer and Will would have been familiar with it. He's playing pinball, and he's it's got the feel of like a Richard Widmark film noir of the 40s. If you can think of any of those stories, Naked City, Cry of the City, anything with the word city in it,
always works.
Yeah, any of those noirs that always had Richard Conte or Richard Widmark, and directed by Joseph H. Lewis. So that's the setting for this. It's about this guy Freddie, who's a loser, and he's decided, even though that the Louis who owns the candy store has known him since he was a kid, he's going to rob the guy. I'm sorry, Max, not Louis, Max. Next, please. So he holds him up, and Max thinks he's kidding because he's known this guy since he was a little kid, and Freddie gets angry and shoots him, and he didn't mean, so he has this horrible tragic turn in Freddie's life, and it's a really hot day in the summer. So Eisner just builds up the story with these, builds the tension, the violence, the guy. Freddie, you're one of the neighborhood boys. I knew you once. You was a kid. So it's this horrible, tragic moment. Next, please. And this is like a classic.
This is great. Yeah.
So some neighborhood kids trying to be tough come in, and they want a soda, and oh look, Freddie's helping out. Oh, why aren't you sweet like Fred, Milty? So Freddie's a good boy. So hey, now cut it. I think the guy is kind of got sort of a hipster zoot suit kind of look. And then of course the girl sees there's blood on his cheek, and she sees the dead guy. And then so that scene where the sound effect really takes on a life of its own as Freddie runs. And yet Eisner here chooses to leave out the background except for the candy store building. And it's really, you know,
It's a great
and
touch.
it's incredible, and that shadow beneath the guy's foot. I mean, this is Will friggin' Eisner. You know, I mean, next please.
A lot of artists would either not put any backgrounds at all or put in the entire background.
Yeah, or make it, you know, or these days make a 2-page splash out of it. You know?
Mm-hmm.
And so this, and we don't, you know, this is Freddie then going through the neighborhood. You know, he's going, you know, he can't believe he did it. He's in this, and of course, Eisner uses that literal ticking clock. Every page starts. It's a minute later. You know, it's now 10:37, and everybody, you know, and Freddie goes and hides. No, he doesn't hide in the theater. He goes into a bar where there's a television on. And next, please. I mean, you know, I don't want to. And then finally, the spirit shows up. Remember the spirit? The spirit shows up with Commissioner Dolan, looking for directions to where that murder was, and Freddie thinks he's gotten away with it, except he hasn't. And the spirit, he's so nervous he drops all his money trying to get into the subway, and the spirit gives it back to him next.
And there it is.
And there it is. So that's the end of. The spirit has figured out that this guy is probably, if not the killer, then somehow involved. I'd like to speak to you. And he what does he do? Punches the spirit and tries to get onto the train and ends up being dragged. Which,
into the
you know,
bar.
it's funny. This is the other story we saw today that ends up in a subway violence on the subway is Master Race also. You know.
Yeah.
And then the punchline is too bad he was only a kid. So many of them are kids, Dolan. They break them in young around here. I wonder just when it was that Freddie started on his crime career, which of course was 10 minutes ago.
10 minutes ago.
And then some guy you are late, always late. But honey, it's only 10:45, 10 minutes late. What's 10 minutes in a man's life?
Interestingly, that means the spirit solved this case in 5 minutes. It's a great story. Yeah.
Yeah.
This was also the one in not the book, the Smithsonian Book of Superheroes. It was this and Gerhart's Schnabel. That was my introduction to the spirit.
Yeah, well, they're the ultimate spirit stories. All right, let's really wrap this up. I just want to get back to Pfeiffer because Pfeiffer is a big part of the story, but this is the outer space spirit. And so this was Pfeiffer and Wally Woods. It was Pfeiffer's layouts, writing, Eisner's editing and co-creating, and Wally Woods drawing. And it's, so Pfeiffer, obviously an Eisner fan as a kid, an Eisner colleague and assistant, and you know, and then they were colleagues and friends through life. But so this is so years cut to 50 years later, however many years later, more 60 years later, Pfeiffer has just finished about a year ago, a trilogy of graphic novels that are film noir, based, very political. Kill My Mother by Jules Pfeiffer. Next, it's a trilogy that involves a private detective who is dressed pretty much like the spirit. I mean, it's obviously a Pfeiffer story, but the panel layout and the perspective and the dialogue is very Eisner, to the point, next please, where the detective talks about my father, Dennis Colt Hannigan, came to this country dirt poor. And then if you read, so that's all I have, but the third volume in the trilogy, which is called The Ghost Script. I don't want to give it away because you should read it, but there's a lot of Eisner in it. All right, next. This came out, this was a big book. This is a large size book that came out for an exhibition of Will's work in his centennial year. With that cover we saw from one of the kitchen sink spirits. Next. This came out, I think, a year or two ago. It's the Contract with God Curator's Edition. As I said, the artwork, the pencils and ink exist separately. and they were on exhibit at the Eater Gallery in Brooklyn about 5 or 6 years ago, and John Lind and Dennis Kitchen put together this curator's collection, which is beautiful. It's two volumes, and one is the pencils reproduced, and one is the inks. Next, please. So this is the set. So if you get a chance to read it, buy it, borrow it, just it's pretty, it gives you an incredible insight into Eisner's working process. Next, you'll see some of the insides. Yeah, that is Will Eisner's pencils, which exist, right? I mean, they're not, most comic book artwork you see, someone is, if it's done old school, if it's not done on a computer, somebody has penciled it, and either they or someone else has gone over it in ink, and really the pencils then cease to exist because the ink is what the artwork is. Well, this is not that. This, and you can see where things were changed, where Eisner changed things between this and what ended up being inked and printed. So it's a fascinating book. Next, please. And that's Will, within a few, I'm not sure exactly, but certainly in his 80s, still drawing as he was doing till literally, the day he, if not literally the day he died, then not too long before it. Next, please. And that's Will and Stan from that DVD I was telling you about, the comic book greats. And if you think this is just an excuse for me to get in a couple of pictures of Stan, a picture of my book cover, you're right. But this is worth searching out, and so is this. And as I might have mentioned 3 hours ago, this is my biography of Stan Lee, which is from St. Martin's Press. There's quite a bit about Will in the book, actually, because their lives and careers sort of intertwined and crisscrossed. There was a time when Stan tried to get Will to take over Marvel Comics as editor-in-chief, which Will had no interest in doing.
Of course he didn't.
And it's from St. Martin's Press. The paperback just came out. I did the audiobook. There's a large type version if you need a large type book. And I'm available to come talk about it. If this was fun, then Danny at DannyFingeroth.com. Doy knows how to find me. I'm all over Facebook. And I guess one thing I just want to mention, Will had such a career, but the Eisner Awards, of course, are named after Will. And so was Will Eisner Week, which again, I mentioned about 2.5 hours ago. Will Eisner Week, we're still doing it this year. So if you want to do something to celebrate Will Eisner, graphic novels, free speech, the comics medium in general, drop me a line at DannyFingeroth.com or go to WillEisner.com, because we're still having Will Eisner Week next year, despite the COVID. We're going to find some way to make it work for people, a combination of live and virtual events. Any questions?
What a tour through history. That was amazing.
Oh, thank you for giving me the time to do it.
That was comprehensive enough that I asked all my questions beforehand. So
good. All right, Doy. So I think I'm going to get going.
Thank you very much.
Once I start speaking about Eisner, obviously, there's no shutting me up. So thank you for this opportunity, and everybody, you and everybody else, stay well, take care of yourselves and each other. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.